Sharon Morgan first met Bonnie Nettles and Herf Applewhite in the summer of '72, and they struck up an unlikely friendship. Sharon, a real estate agent in Houston, probably never thought she'd find herself seeking spiritual guidance from a couple of self-proclaimed prophets at some metaphysical shop downtown. Sharon was a smart, ambitious career woman and the proud mother of 2 beautiful daughters, and as far as her colleagues and clients could tell, she was living the dream. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, some intangible, indescribable something that was just bigger than herself, something beyond.
Bonnie and Herf, or the two as they called themselves, definitely piqued her interest, but between work and family, it's hard enough to find time for a weekend trip, much less a spiritual journey. Life just got in the way. As the months dragged on, her husband grew more abusive, she grew more despondent, and that deep, dark emptiness inside her grew into a chasm. It felt like every day was little more than a cruel performance for the sake of the kids and the clients, and she couldn't keep it up much longer. So in the summer of 1974, she wrote a letter to Bonnie Nettles. She wasn't really expecting a response, she just didn't know where else to turn. But a letter came a few weeks later, postmarked from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and it had one hell of a lead-in.
We are not anything we were in the past.
And whether it was destiny or desperation, Sharon Morgan knew in her heart that she had to go all in.
Bonnie and Herf had been on the road for 16 months, proselytizing in parking lots, camping where they could, and selling their own blood for bags of cheap dinner rolls. They were broke, exhausted, and ready to cut their losses when Sharon's letter showed up in their P.O. box. It was the sign they'd been praying for all along. As the two rolled into Houston, Sharon packed a bag, put $25 cash in her pocket, and left 2 notes on the dresser beneath her wedding ring. One was for her daughters, saying she loved them, and the other was for her husband. It might be best, it read, to imagine that God had simply taken me away in death. She hopped in the back seat of Herf and Bonnie's car and watched in the rear view as her life, her family, and that damn dark emptiness slid off the edge of the Texas horizon.
Sharon's people skills came in handy on the road, and the two had her post up outside occult and metaphysical shops watching for anyone who might be, quote, pulsing good vibrations, and whenever she'd find them, she'd give them the pitch.
Would you be interested in talking to 2 people who could tell you how to leave this planet and take your body with you?
You can sell damn near anything with a big Texan smile, but not everything. For all her efforts and charm, she wasn't having much luck converting the non-believers, and her relationship with the two was starting to strain. They didn't much like her proclivity for asking questions about the faith, and she didn't much like their proclivity for skipping out on restaurant checks and running up her credit cards. After a month of failure, and what felt a whole lot like criminality, Sharon had a, quote, dark night of the soul. It wasn't that she doubted them or their message. She believed all of it, wholly and completely. She just needed some time to herself, to think. As fate would have it, they were scheduled for a stop in Dallas, where she could meet up with an old friend and get a much-needed taste of home.
But her friend didn't come alone. Sharon's husband, red with rage, grabbed her, screaming, and dragged her to his car, threatening to have her committed. Sharon watched tearfully in the rear view as Bonnie and Herf, her hope and salvation, faded away in the airport smog. She hated her husband for all he'd taken from her. She hated him, the world, herself. But when she held her screaming and crying daughters in her arms, she knew her journey had come to an end. The emptiness inside her, be damned. It could take her, all of her, bit by piece by shred, and maybe in time, it would. But her kids were the only light she needed in this world gone dark.
Bonnie and Herf, racked with guilt and despair, found a light of their own, flashing in the rear view, blue and red. Sharon's husband had called the cops on them for credit card fraud, and Herf had a warrant out for his arrest in St. Louis. Their beat-up green sedan was a rental, and Herf had neglected to return it, for 9 months. It didn't mean anything to him at the time, but it seems worth noting that the car was a Mercury model they don't make anymore, the Comet. Herf was sentenced to 6 months in a Missouri prison for grand theft auto, and he insisted till the day they let him go that he was an innocent man. After all, God himself had given him permission to keep the car. He put his jail time to good use, though, ruminating on the message, developing, refining, and writing everything down. Tracts blossomed into manifestos, and soon everything just became so clear.
There was an evolutionary level above human, and anyone, all of us, could get there if only we give up our earthly lives and families and follow the two on the righteous path before it's too late. Bonnie and Herf, as they saw it, were the two witnesses, the two lampstands prophesied in the book of Revelation. And when the time comes, the Lamb will open the 7 seals, and the beast will ascend to earth from the bottomless pit, with hell on his heels. Bonnie and Herf will die by his fangs and talons, but God will raise them up from death and send down a UFO to ferry them up to heaven.
In the early months of 1975, the two were finally reunited outside the prison walls. They may not have had any money or a place to go, but they had each other. And the mission. They checked into a hotel room in Ojai, California, and sent their flyers to every spiritual center in town. A few days later, they got an invitation to speak at the house of an aging mystic by the name of Clarence Klug. Around 80 people showed up to Klug's Los Angeles home to hear Bonnie and Herf lay out their message and their offer. The presentation lasted only about 30 minutes, and Klug wasn't impressed. He thought their doomsayer spiel came off as kinda silly, which is saying something coming from a self-proclaimed psychic whose personal slogan was, "Weird turns me on."
But much to Klug's chagrin and surprise, about 24 of the folks who showed up that night decided they had to go all in on Bonnie and Herf. And over the next 2 decades, hundreds more would come along for the ride. One of the attendees, Dick Jocelyn, asked to meet up with Herf in private to feel him out and ask some questions. He was a 26-year-old college graduate and former Navy officer, and his modeling career was actually taking off. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Bonnie and Herf's proposition was unusual, no doubt about that. But even if it turned out that they couldn't fill that deep, dark emptiness inside him, at least they acknowledged it was there, and no one else ever had.
"I know you're not con artists,"
he told Herf.
"That means either you're who you say you are, or you're absolutely mad."
"That's right, Dick,"
Herf said.
"Which do you think we are?"
The next day, Dick Jocelyn gave up his car, his apartment, his career, and his parents to join Bonnie, Herf, and the others on the spiritual path they'd come to call Heaven's Gate. Most of us like to think of ourselves as incredulous, rational people. We have a hard time imagining how anyone could possibly be gullible enough to give up everything they have, their families, their jobs, their lives, just because some dude in a Whataburger parking lot promised them a ride on Jesus Christ's UFO. But maybe we give ourselves a little too much credit.
We've all been there at some point, searching for whatever it is that might fill that emptiness inside us, be it faith, guidance, meaning, love, death, just something bigger, something beyond. Most of the people who joined Heaven's Gate had a good education, successful careers, happy families, and what most folks might call normal lives. There was just something missing. And as macabre as it might sound, in a way, they found it. I'm Ryan Sheffield.
And I'm Brad Dewar.
And this is TEX ARCANA.
On a day easy when I die. On a day easy when I die. On a day easy when I die. Scream salvation as I fly. On a day easy when I die.
Welcome to the second half of our 2-episode dive into the faith, fear, and fanaticism that shaped and warped the cultural landscape of Texas. If you missed our last episode, no worries. Just like this one, it's a series of chronological vignettes that can stand on their own, so you won't be lost no matter where you jump in.
In the first half of our journey, we explored utopian visions of Texas as heaven on earth. This time around, we're a little more southbound. And fair warning, the stories we're about to tell you are very dark, very graphic, and very real.
Bonnie and Herf weren't the first people to see their own lives prophesized in the book of Revelation, and they wouldn't be the last. With all due respect to John the Revelator, he was just a little off on his timeline. The two lampstands may have found their first disciples that fateful night in 1975, but 6 years earlier, and 8 miles south, the beast from the bottomless pit had already come.
The 1960s were a decade of cultural upheaval and revolution. The world was in the throes of an existential crisis, and the escalating tensions between Soviet communism and the capitalist West were dragging the world to the brink of annihilation. Sovereign nations were undermined, invaded, and reduced to pawns. Democracies were birthed in blood and trampled by proxy as the bomb craters and power vacuums became the ready-made mass graves of genocide. McCarthy's communist witch hunt had finally died years earlier and unceremoniously on the Senate floor, but its shadow still loomed over every aspect of American life, feeding on the ever-present threat of a Cold War gone hot and needling at the worst fears and darkest impulses of a nation gripped by paranoia. The people still believed in witches, and they were among us, hiding in plain sight.
As TV shows were making the transition from black and white to vibrant color, the political and social fabric of the country was doing the very same. American culture was cleaving at the fault lines of tradition and progress, and any middle ground there might have been was crumbling into the growing chasm between. A new American duality was taking shape, a culture that existed in contradiction to itself, tearing itself apart from within and holding together only by the ever-fraying thread of fear. After all, we're all in this together when the bombs come down. In a decade of marching forward and lashing back, the turning point and breaking point was 1964. It was the year people of color and student activists took the fight for freedom and equality to the streets, campuses, jails, and televisions of America. It was the year they took it all the way to the halls of Congress, and for many of them, to an untimely grave.
It was the year Lyndon B. Johnson, a good old boy from Stonewall, Texas, thrust into the Oval Office on a bullet from Dallas, signed the Civil Rights Act into law, ostensibly ending racial segregation in America, rending the Democratic Party in two, and giving rise to a new American right, riding high on the political weaponization of white rage. Senator Barry Goldwater, a firebrand populist from Arizona, was running for president on a platform of militant anti-communism, indiscriminate use of nuclear weapons, and staunch opposition to the Civil Rights Act. He got 75% of the vote in the Texas Republican primary and accepted the GOP nomination in a packed auditorium in Dallas. Goldwater lost to LBJ in a landslide that November, but his spirit and his message would come to shape the ascendant right wing for decades to come. 1964 was the year that a step toward justice and equality brought us closer together as a nation and drove us irreconcilably apart.
And it was in that year that Charles Denton Watson, a 19-year-old in Coatesville, Texas, heard the Beatles for the very first time. In a place like Coatesville, social progress was an unwelcome visitor with a tendency to darken the doorstep long after she was due and well before she was welcome, usually met on the porch with sidelong glances and the cock of a shotgun. But Charles Watson was smitten, head over heels, from the moment she rolled into town. Charles was what you might call the all-American boy, a high school track star who lettered in football, honor student, Boy Scout, editor of the school newspaper. He worked for his dad at the family's roadside general store since he was 6 years old and led a youth group at the Methodist Church in his off time. He was a good kid who went to service every Sunday and prayed every night.
But Charles, like a lot of kids, only knew God as an abstraction, this vague amalgamation of his mom and Santa Claus. An invisible, inconsistent disciplinarian who was quick to tell him why not, but unwilling or unable to properly explain why. And like most of us know all too well, puberty is a way of complicating things. Charles was deeply fascinated by girls, something he'd attribute to problems later in life. When he was 16, he started seeing a girl who had what church folks called a reputation. And in a place like Coatesville, word got around. His parents made him break it off with her, and he promised he would, just like he promised them he'd stay away from the beer.
Mom wasn't very hard to fool,
he wrote.
So I suppose God wouldn't be either.
But in a town of less than 200 people, the wide-open plains of Collin County were starting to feel more like prison walls. Charles Denton Watson wanted to experience what the world had to offer, to live life, have fun, and hopefully meet some girls who didn't grow up on the same street as his parents. Coatesville was his hometown. He loved it, and for the most part, it loved him. But Coatesville couldn't keep secrets for shit. In the fall of 1964, he enrolled in North Texas State University, known these days as UNT, in his middle namesake city of Denton. Sure, it was only 50 miles away from home, but for Charles, that was huge. It was freedom.
Denton was, and is, a unique place. With its relatively small population, absence of skyscrapers, and quaint downtown square, the city has always had a kind of small-town charm, despite being home to 2 major universities. Plus, it's basically 30 minutes from everything, offering a kid like Charles a taste of distance and freedom without being too far from the comforts of home. In full disclosure, we live in Denton, so we might be a little biased. But if we had to describe it objectively, it's kinda like Austin if all the cool people that moved there had just stayed home.
But in 1964, the counterculture hadn't quite found its foothold in town, and Charles fit right in. He'd later write,
In other parts of the country, students were taken off in new directions that would not only lead a whole generation to a radical break from the comfortable 50s womb we'd all grown up in, but would destroy that world forever. We didn't know or care about all that in Denton. For us, college still meant fraternities and hazing and driving down to Dallas with a fake ID that got you into German beer halls where you drank out of pottery steins and sang along with a polka band.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Charles joined the infamous party frat, Phi Kappa Alpha, and fell in love with the libertine absurdity of Greek life. If Copeville couldn't keep secrets, Denton just didn't have any. He woke up every morning, or afternoon, knowing he could do whatever he wanted and no one, not God, Mom, or Santa Claus, could stop him. No one gave a damn if he lived or died. It was heaven on earth. But the perpetual hangover was tanking his GPA, and some run-ins with the law gave his parents and his past a chance to worm their way into his new life. His mother badgered him to focus on his schooling and please come back to church. But he was done with all that, and he was starting to think that Denton might not be far enough away.
Junior year, he got a job working the graveyard shift as a baggage handler at Love Field Airport in Dallas, and it came with some killer perks. Charles had never even ridden on a plane before, and now he was cashing in free flight passes every weekend, taking girls on exotic getaways to Mexico and Hawaii. It was, in the parlance of the times, pretty groovy. One weekend, he flew out to LA to visit his friend Rich, a frat brother who hightailed it out of Texas the second he walked off the graduation stage. Rich wanted to give Charles the full LA experience, taking him out to clubs and shows, introducing him to weed that blew his mind and women whose minds were blown when he stood up and called them ma'am.
Los Angeles made Denton look like Copeville with a bar and a bus route. People back home in Texas sure like to talk a lot about freedom, but those folks ain't never been to LA. When he got back home, he called up his parents and told them he was moving to California. Quote,
I didn't want anyone, ever again, to tell me what to do.
Unfortunately, it didn't really work out that way. Charles adapted quick and easy to his new life in California, for a Texas boy at least. He got a job as a wig salesman, and he was pretty good at it. With his commissions from the shop and a little dope slinging on the side, he was making enough money to do California right. He replaced all his flyover state clothes with a hip new wardrobe, grew out his hair, and came to the long overdue realization that college was a waste of time. It was nothing but a brainwash machine that chewed up free spirits and spit out cops and squares. So in 1968, Charles Watson turned on, tuned in, and dropped out of Cal State. When a car wreck landed him in the hospital, his mom came out to visit him for the first time. She missed him, of course, the whole family did. And like any Texan mom, she worried about him sometimes. But Charles was living the California dream. The wreck may have busted his knee, but it also knocked his name off the Vietnam draft rolls, and he was making more than enough money to keep the bills paid on time. Of course, he left out the part about being a full-time pot dealer at that point, but what Mom, God, and Santa don't know can't hurt him. He kissed her goodbye and told her,
Mom, I'm never coming home again.
But like we say, Texas just has a way.
One summer night in 1968, Charles was cruising down Sunset Boulevard when a hitchhiker flagged him down from the shoulder. It was a guy around his own age, with long wavy hair and some good vibrations about him. He introduced himself as Dennis Wilson, the drummer for a band called the Beach Boys. Charles hadn't really heard much of their stuff, but his brother back in Texas was a big fan. They drove up the road to Wilson's house in Pacific Palisades, a beautiful and massive hunting lodge that once belonged to the legendary humorist Will Rogers. Charles had never seen anything like it, not even in the fancy part of Dallas. And when Dennis invited him in to meet some friends and smoke some grass, he sure as hell wasn't going to say no.
Dean Morehouse met him at the door, a middle-aged Methodist minister turned acid guru, and he practically dragged Charles into the living room. A raspy voice drifted through the haze of weed and camels, riding shotgun on the abrasive jangle of an old guitar. Charles winced the smoke out of his eyes and saw a man in his early 30s with messy hair and a scruffy beard, strumming out the weirdness for a rapt audience of young women, each one pretty enough to end all war with a wink and a smile, and everyone mesmerized by the gravelly croons of a man Dennis Wilson liked to call the Wizard.
"This is Charlie,"
Dean said.
"Charlie Manson."
Real quick side note.
While researching this segment, this entire episode really, we came across a lot of different perspectives and conflicting accounts. We're drawing heavily here from Watson's autobiography, so there may be some inaccuracies, lies, or delusions skittering between the shadows of verifiable fact. But sometimes the best, and only, history we have is wedged somewhere between the testimony and the truth. And there's always more than one side to every story.
Shout out to our fellow true crime podcast fans. Please don't add us.
This is Tex Watson's side of that story.
There was just something about the guy, Charlie Manson. Conversations with him veered into diatribes that ricocheted between deep philosophical musings and the deranged soliloquy of a bus station wino. There was this dark intensity to his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who'd seen a lot of pain in his life and held it so deep down, you couldn't help but wonder if it was something he'd experienced or something he'd inflicted. It was mysterious, intoxicating, scary. But Dean and Dennis were in love with the guy. Everyone was, especially the girls.
Charles started spending more and more time at the mansion, chilling out with Dean and his endless buffet of pot, acid, mescaline, coke, speed, and God knows what. The girls came and went at all hours of the day and night, at least a dozen of them, maybe more. And Charles Watson was just drunk on the beautiful weirdness of it all.
Dean talked about Manson constantly, and for the most part, Charles just half listened or tuned him out while the dope did its thing. But with every acid trip they took, it was making more and more sense. The girls followed Manson around like sheep, obeying his every command. And to Charles, that was like a fantasy come true. And it wasn't just about the power dynamics. Everyone was in love with everyone. They shared everything. They had no rules, no boundaries, and they seemed to accept one another for who they were, unconditionally, almost like
a family,
Dean said, and Charles wanted in.
Back in May, Wilson had picked up a couple of the girls hitchhiking, and before long, Charlie Manson and the rest of the family showed up in his driveway. Wilson gave them free reign of the place and bankrolled their every whim, loaning them his cars, his credit cards, even buying the penicillin shots for their frequent run-ins with the clap. In exchange, Manson gave him free reign over the girls. In a matter of months, Wilson had spent what today would amount to $720,000 on the family. But by August, they were starting to wear out their welcome. Wilson needed a break from the nonstop partying and Manson's erratic, aggressive mood swings. He up and left his house one day without explanation, and his manager came by to kick the family out for good. Charlie and the girls found a new home for themselves at a place called Spawn Ranch, and with nowhere else to go, Charles and Dean came with. The 55-acre ranch in East LA had once served as a set for Western B-movies, Marlboro commercials, and a couple episodes of Bonanza, but by that point, it was run down and washed up, barely keeping afloat by renting out horses on the weekends.
The owner was an 80-year-old blind man named George Spawn, who agreed to let the family live there in exchange for work on the ranch and, of course, sexual favors from the girls. He was especially fond of Lynette Frome, who he nicknamed Squeaky for the sound she made when he touched her, and who, 6 years later, would attempt to assassinate President Gerald Ford and end up in a Fort Worth prison until her parole in 2009. But anyway, Spawn had a knack for assigning nicknames and making them stick, so when Charles Watson introduced himself, the old man instantly pegged his drawl and gave him a new name, Tex. Manson loved it. After all, there could only be one Charlie.
They settled into their new life on the ranch, and the family was growing fast. Within weeks, there were 30 people living there, mostly women, which struck Tex as a little strange. Charlie made no secret of his misogyny or racism. He would rant about the inferiority of, quote, Blackie, or his belief that women existed only as subhuman sex property, and everyone just nodded along. His voice, his cadence and conviction, it didn't matter if you agreed or approved or even believed what he said. There was just something about the guy. Even Dennis Wilson couldn't bring himself to completely sever ties. He introduced Manson to Terry Melcher, the record producer for the Byrds, and he even pushed for the Beach Boys to record one of Manson's songs. And they actually did it. But it didn't turn out to be the big break Manson hoped for. They changed the title, rewrote the lyrics, and ditched Charlie's bluesy riffs. Worst of all, they robbed him of the songwriting credit, which meant no royalties from sales.
Charlie was pissed. After all, he was born to be a rock star. He was entitled to it, and those fat cat Hollywood bastards stole his dreams out from under him. One day, the world was going to recognize him for his talent and brilliance. One day, people like Dennis Wilson were going to eat crow when they saw Charlie Manson's face on the cover of the Rolling Stone. And only a year later, it would be.
Charlie took everyone up to Sacramento for a week to get away from it all, but his scorn and resentment were just as infectious among the family as the skin disease Sadie picked up from some guy who'd just gotten out of prison. By the time they got back to Spawn Ranch, Tex was confused, depressed, and doubting. His image of Charlie as a loving, benevolent friend and spiritual guide was starting to crack and peel in places, and he didn't much care for the spiteful, petty asshole he saw lurking beneath.
It was late November 1968, and the Beatles had just dropped a brand new, self-titled double LP. As the family gathered around the turntable in the living room to drop the needle, Tex snuck off to the kitchen to call his friend Rich. He just needed a place to crash while he figured things out, just a place to think. As side 3, track 6, tore through the living room walls, Tex hung up the phone. He'd never have a better chance than he did right then. No one heard the back door slam shut behind him, drowned under the driving crash of the chorus, Helter Skelter.
Pensive soul-searching, it turns out, was kinda boring. Rich worked all day, and there just ain't much to do in LA when you're broke. And then Luella started coming around. She was Rich's ex, a small-time dope dealer Tex had met once or twice at a party, and he fell hard. Within days, he'd moved in with her as friends, lovers, and business partners. Luella was mostly just selling pot to her friends, maybe a little acid here and there, but together they decided to go big. Within weeks, they were rolling in cash. Tex got himself a respectable haircut, some stylish clothes, and a copy of that new Beatles album. He and Luella learned every word by heart. It was a damn good record.
He was happy, truly happy, but Charlie refused to let him go. He was everywhere, in the songs on the radio, in the eyes of total strangers on the streets, in the reflection in the mirror. He was like an intrusive thought, the kind that creeps into your head while you're driving and makes you wonder, if only for a fleeting moment, what it might be like to steer the car into oncoming traffic. You can shake it off, shut it out, push it back down to whatever fucked up back alley of your brain it slunk out from, but it's still there, and it always comes back. No matter how far you run from your problems and your past, you can't run away from who you really are. The girls picked up the phone on the first ring. It felt good to hear their voices, but something was up. They were excited, talking over each other.
Everything's changed, Tex. You've gotta come back.
Come home. The next day, he packed a bag and hitched a ride to Spawn Ranch. The girls rushed to meet him on the porch and threw themselves into his arms. They got him out of his square Hollywood clothes and into something decent. Then they sat him down to fill him in on the big news. Charlie, it seemed, had a brand new bag. Dig this.
The Beatles got wind that Jesus had returned to Earth somewhere in LA, and the White Album is a sign, a message, a signal that it's time for Charlie to start planting the seeds of Helter Skelter. He's the 5th Beatle, man, the 5th angel. And once he gets this album out to the world, the Beatles are gonna come find him, and us too, because they're the avenging locust swarm, you know? Beatles and locusts are like basically the same thing.
It's Helter Skelter, man, revolution. Like the White Album is all these messages for Charlie, like secret codes, laying everything out, how it's all gonna go down.
It's coming down fast.
First it'll hit the piggy neighborhoods, the fat cat enclaves like Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The black folks are gonna sneak into piggy homes and shock the fucking world. Charlie says karma's gonna roll for Blackie, and it's gonna be sheer savage butchery, man. I'm talking mutilation, eviscerations, messages scrawled in blood, unspeakable fucking carnage. And the whites, they're gonna go nutso. Mass hysteria, paranoia, chaos, and Whitey being Whitey, they're gonna cash in on it, like an excuse to go straight up slaughterhouse on the blacks. Thousands dead, a fucking Holocaust. But dig this, it's all part of the plan. The dead are just the Uncle Toms, you know. The true black race is hiding out the whole time, waiting for the chance to take the stage and be like, look here, see what you done to my people, and then bam, whites are split down the middle, the left's gonna feel all guilty, and the right won't give a good goddamn, and then we got ourselves a civil war that makes the old one look like howdy doody, man. Families taking sides, parents shooting their own kids, kids slitting their parents' throats in America, and the whole wide world is gonna go up like a fucking match and burn.
When the dust comes down, the blacks will pick off whatever whites ain't been cold and take over the whole show. But then there's Charlie and us. We've been hiding out the whole time, down under the desert in the bottomless pit, living like kings while the earth is steeped and stewed in its own blood. That shit's in the Bible, man, and we're gonna hang down there and do our thing till our babies have babies, and there's 144,000. Like a lot, okay? And then, when we get to the bottom, we're gonna go right back to the top of the slide. See what I'm saying? We're gonna go for a goddamn ride. Charlie says Blackie's gonna fuck shit up. They're gonna be waiting for us whites to come run things right, because we got the smarts, you know? And they're gonna turn to Charlie, Jesus fucking Christ himself, and he's gonna have the whole world in his hands. It's gonna be a fucking gas.
It was a lot for Tex to take in, and as you might imagine, he had a few questions. But now just wasn't the time to get into it. He didn't care what crazy trip they were on. He was just happy to be home, surrounded by love, where he belonged. And with a little time and a few dozen tabs of acid, Helter Skelter started to make some sense. At least, sort of. In a way. Somewhere between the trips and rants, Charlie managed to line up a recording session with that producer, Terry Melcher. They were stoked, but Melcher never showed. After all, he was hip to Wilson's weird relationship with the family, the mood swings, the drugs, the threats. But to Charlie, this was nothing short of betrayal, treason. Melcher was supposed to be the one, the man who'd make him famous and put everything in motion, but he turned out to be just another Hollywood piggy. And like the Beatles say, side 2, track 4, what the piggies need is a damn good whackin'.
Meanwhile, Tex was trying his best to convince Luella to come join him at the ranch and maybe become part of the family, but she just wasn't sold on the whole supernatural race war thing. And in all fairness, he wasn't all that sure about it himself. Tex started taking regular trips to Hollywood to get away and get some perspective. But brooding quickly devolved into psychedelic benders that found him hiding in the back of pickup trucks and freaking out the drivers, or scooping up children off the streets and hiding them in the bushes to save them from Helter Skelter. It was only a matter of time before the pigs cracked down, and on April 23, 1969, Tex Watson was arrested in Van Nuys for public intoxication. Apparently some people got concerned when they saw a full-grown man slithering on the ground like a snake through a crowd of schoolchildren shouting, "Beep, beep." His mugshot from the escapade eventually became the go-to photo for any article about him in the press. If you Google image search his name, it's one of the first photos that come up. You'll know which one. It was also the first and only time he got fingerprinted, and that would come back to haunt him in a big way.
Back at the ranch, Charlie's sermons, which had always been frequent, long, and kinda hard to follow, were becoming increasingly focused on the themes of fear and death, and how they could be wielded as a weapon. He started sending the girls out on what he called creepy crawls, nightly missions of breaking into homes and wealthy neighborhoods and rearranging their belongings while they slept. The idea was to make the piggies wake up afraid, and the practice they were getting in the art of breaking and entering didn't hurt either.
Night after night, he'd gather them into a circle around an empty chair and tell them to imagine some piggy sitting right there. Imagine his deepest, darkest fears, visualize them, and project them like a psychic knife right into the piggy's cold black heart. Charlie was feeding them a steady diet of LSD, and it's speculated that he only pretended to take it himself, leaving him grounded enough to be their guide. Not that we've ever done it, of course, but from what we hear, acid has a way of tearing down the ego, one's sense of self, scattering the consciousness into fragments that ebb and flow with the natural pulse of everything around you, erasing the boundary between real and unreal, right and wrong. And when the vibe is right, just about anything can sound like a good idea. Charles Denton Watson was starting to feel like nothing more than a memory, a construct, a fiction. There was only Tex and Charlie. Always Charlie.
On some level, Tex knew this was all just a revenge fantasy. Charlie had been in and out of jail since he was 13 years old. He never had a childhood or a loving family back in Texas, worrying sick about their wayward son and how long it had been since he'd been to church. Charlie Manson was born in hell and grew up in a cage. The world outside was a hostile, foreign land, and after 17 years confined and condemned, the beast had finally risen from the pit to rain holy hell on the damned. Charlie fantasized about building a jail in the sewers where he could be the warden, and the big fat piggies in their starch white shirts would cower in their cells when Warden Charlie's baton came a-clanking across the bars. Karma's gonna roll. Yes, she is.
It was June 1969 when Charlie pulled Tex aside and whispered in his ear,
If Blackie don't make his move soon, we'll have to start helter-skelter for him.
anything can sound like a good idea if the vibe is right.
Case in point.
One night, he and I were waiting in the parking lot of the casino, waiting for the right victims, when two elderly ladies came out to their car, one of them crippled. Charlie pulled up to block their exit and sent me with a knife to force them into our car. I crept forward slowly, then suddenly appeared at their window, flashing my blade. The woman who was driving accelerated violently, nearly running me down as she swung around our car and took off down the driveway. We spent about 15 minutes chasing them all over the north end of the valley before they finally lost us. Charlie had been cheated out of his pig, but he'd gained something. He'd seen that at least one member of the family had reached the point he'd try to do anything Charlie asked, even kill.
Well, almost anything. Tex and a couple of the girls had an affinity for methamphetamine. It was like a performance-enhancing drug, the opposite of acid. But Charlie hated it, and he wouldn't allow it at the ranch. He thought it was bad for the body, which is kind of funny, all things considered. So Tex smuggled it in and kept it in baby food jars under the porch. He was willing to kill for Manson, but he wasn't willing to give up his speed. If Mom was so easily fooled, why not Charlie?
Manson was obsessed with dune buggies. He was convinced they were necessary in the quest for the bottomless pit, and he started pushing the family members for cash to pad the buggy fund. Charlie knew all about Luella. There were no secrets among the family, except the crank under the porch, of course, and Tex dutifully called her up. She, of course, refused, but Charlie wouldn't take no for an answer. Tex waited a few days, then called her up again, saying he had a sweet deal lined up for a big haul of grass, too good to pass up. All she had to do was go with him to an apartment complex somewhere in town and front him the cash to make the sale. She reluctantly agreed, but insisted on bringing a friend of hers, a low-level dealer named Bernard Latsapapa Crow.
When the three of them pulled into the complex, Crow insisted that Luella stay in the car with him while Tex scored the dope. If he tried anything funny, Crow said he'd hurt her. Bad. Tex smiled wide and played up his drawl.
No, I always come back for my girl.
You can sell damn near anything with a Texan accent. We just sound so dadgum polite when we lie through our teeth. Tex gave him a wave, went upstairs with the cash, and ducked down a corridor to the other side of the building where a family member was waiting with a car, and then they floored it back to the ranch. The phone was already ringing. Big Crow might have been bluffing about hurting Luella, but he was royally pissed about getting scammed. He said if they didn't give him back his money now, he'd come down there and kill them all. And this time, it didn't sound like a bluff. The line went dead, and Charlie sent Tex up into the hills to hide out while he cleaned up his mess. Tex came down to the ranch the next morning to find out what had gone down.
Charlie and another family member, TJ, drove out to Big Crow's apartment. Charlie told Crow he wanted to clear the air and make things right. TJ was supposed to grab the .22 out of Charlie's waistband and shoot Crow dead, but he froze up. So Charlie pulled the gun and pulled the trigger. Crow stood up, grinning.
You're crazy! You come at me with an empty...
Crow hit the ground with a bullet in the chest and his entourage backed off, hands up. Charlie nicked a buckskin jacket from one of the guys, grabbed TJ, and ran out the door. It was the same jacket he'd be wearing over his handcuffs when the news cameras introduced the world to Charlie Manson for the very first time. Charlie spent the whole day bragging that he'd, quote, plugged Blackie. So when news broke of a body turning up somewhere near UCLA, they all assumed it was Crow. The victim had been identified as a member of the Black Panther Party, and Charlie's peacocking mood faded to black. The Panthers were a fearsome presence at the time, armed to the teeth and unforgiving. Paranoia swept through the ranch, and Charlie prepared the family for inevitable retribution. What Manson didn't know was that Bernard Crow wasn't a Black Panther, and he wasn't even dead. His boys took him to the hospital and he recovered just fine. He never even called the cops.
In an acid-fueled frenzy, Tex and Charlie went to the Army surplus store to buy survival gear and knives. Lots and lots of knives. On the way back, they got pulled over by the LAPD. The cops searched the car and found stacks of cash under a bag of blades, so they detained them for questioning for a few hours before letting them go. But they knew something was up. Goddamn hippie burnouts don't have that kind of cash just lying around on the floorboards. A few days later, the LAPD raided Spawn Ranch. But Manson was more than prepared. Most of the family was already camping out in the hills, hiding from the imaginary Black Panther vengeance. And Charlie had hired a biker gang, the Straight Satans, to work security around the ranch. The Satans tipped off the family via walkie-talkie, and the cops left the ranch empty-handed. But paranoia can't buy no doom buggies, so the family got to work in any and every way they knew how. Drugs and theft. One of the girls, Katie, even jacked and chopped a Volkswagen right off the dealership lot and dumped the shell in a ravine.
But it was never enough. Charlie was convinced that an acquaintance of theirs, a musician and teacher named Gary Hinman, had a sizable stash of cash that was ripe for the taking. You know, like a teacher does. So on July 25th, 1969, Charlie sent 3 family members, Sadie, Bobby, and Mary, to pay Gary a visit and, quote,
"Lay so much fear on him, he'll give you everything he has."
Tex didn't find out what happened till they got back days later, and even then he had to coax the details out of the girls where he could. As far as he could piece it together, this is what went down.
The trio paid a friendly visit to Gary's place and demanded cash, but he swore he didn't have any. There was some back and forth, then Bobby lost his cool and pulled a gun and smacked Gary across the face with the barrel. He was bleeding, crying, and swearing to Christ there wasn't any money. So Bobby tied him up and called the ranch.
"He's not cooperating, Charlie. What do we do?"
Charlie borrowed a sword from one of the Straight Satans and drove out to the house, but Gary told him the same thing he told the others. There just isn't any money. So Charlie chopped off a piece of Gary's ear, stole a set of bagpipes off a shelf, and drove back to the ranch.
Mary stitched up the ear with some dental floss, and Gary begged them to just let him go. Please, just go. Gary was a peacenik, a New Age spiritual type. He didn't believe in violence. A lot of good that did him. They spent the next day watching him in shifts, beating him, demanding cash that wasn't there. Gary did everything he could to comply. He even signed over the pink slip for his car, but he didn't have anything else to give. The torture went on for another whole day before Bobby finally decided Gary was telling the truth. Back at the ranch, Charlie picked up the phone and said,
"You know what to do."
Bobby hung up, pulled out his knife, and plunged it deep into Gary's chest, pulled it out, and did it again. Then the 3 of them took turns holding a pillow over his face until Gary Hinman suffocated to death with prayer beads clenched in his fist, muttering a Buddhist chant for peace through the blood in his throat.
Bobby dipped his fingers in the blood and scrawled "Political Piggy" on the wall, along with a crude attempt at a paw print, hoping the cops would pin the death on the Black Panthers. Then he hightailed it back to the ranch. He went back 2 days later to see if anyone had found the body. They hadn't, and he bragged to anyone in earshot that he could hear the maggots crunching inside the corpse. The next morning, he left for a drive up the coast and managed to get himself busted by the pigs. They found him passed out on the side of the road in Gary's stolen car, wearing the same clothes he'd worn to Gary's house with the knife stashed in the trunk, both still crusted in Gary's blood. It was August 6, 1969, and Bobby Buselli was locked up in LA County, facing charges of first-degree murder.
Charlie told everyone to keep quiet and lay low, and he disappeared for a couple days to figure things out. The family needed a plan. He needed a way to misdirect the cops, to divert their attention to something else. Something so similar to what Bobby had done, the piggies would think they'd botched things, that they'd locked up the wrong guy. It wasn't loyalty, it was self-preservation. He had to do something before the pigs made Bobby squeal. Charlie showed back up at the ranch on August 8th and called a family meeting to break the big news.
Now is the time for Helter Skelter.
The sun was sinking down behind the hills, and Tex was coming down from some acid when Charlie took him out for a walk.
"I got a favor I want you to do for me tonight, but it'll take a lot of nerve to do it."
"Whatever you want, Charlie."
He leaned against one of the cars, a strange look in his dark eyes. Strange even for him. He brought up Terry Melcher, the cat who'd burned him on the record deal. Apparently he had a house out on Cielo Drive.
But he didn't even live there anymore.
I want you to take a couple of the girls and go down there,"
Charlie said,
"and totally destroy everyone in that house, as gruesome as you can."
Melcher had moved to Malibu months ago. He'd been renting the house out to some big-shot movie director, Roman Polanski. A total pig for sure, but a stranger.
"Take some rope and some of the good knives. Whoever's in there, I want you to kill them all. Make it a real nice murder, just as bad as you've ever seen. Pull out their eyes and hang them on the mirrors, and get all their money."
Tex nodded along and tried to focus on the acid crackling through his jaw and sliding off his spine back into the ether. He tried not to think.
"Write something on the wall with the blood, like helter skelter, rise."
I can't remember all that.
"That's okay. The girls will know what to write."
Manson pressed a gun into his hands and headed up to the house to get the girls. The acid couldn't dull the edges of what was happening, what was about to happen. Tonight he was going to become a murderer. Tex ran up to the porch and dug out his baby food jar of speed, blew a few rails, took a deep breath, and went to fetch some rope. They all met up at the car. Sadie, Katie, and Linda walked up barefoot, which seemed a little impractical to him. Tex opted for cowboy boots. He started up the engine and the girls piled into the back, and Charlie leaned into the open window.
"Remember to leave a sign. Something witchy."
Tex hit the gas and watched in the rear view as Charlie, waving goodbye, disappeared into the darkness.
They kept getting turned around and lost, and it didn't help that everyone was a bundle of nerves ready to snap and a pothole away from ralphing out the car window. It was around midnight when they finally pulled up to 10050 Cielo Drive. Tex stopped at the gate, shimmied up the telephone pole and cut the line, then parked the car on the street. As they cleared the fence, headlights shined in the driveway. Then as the driver rolled down the window to press the gate button, Tex appeared from the shadows, gun in one hand and knife in the other. Behind the wheel, he saw a teenage boy, his face twisted and swollen in terror. Or maybe it was just the acid.
Please don't hurt me. I'm your friend. I won't tell."
The boy raised his hands to shield his face, so Tex slashed his arm with the knife, then shot him 4 times, until he slumped over silent in the seat. He didn't know at the time that the kid had a name, Stephen Parent. He didn't care. Tex cut the motor and pushed the car off the drive, out of sight from the road. As far as he could tell, no one inside the house heard the shots. Everything was locked up tight, except one small window in the entryway that was cracked open a few inches. Tex told Linda to go back to the gate and stand watch. Katie followed behind her. He cut through the screen, crawled inside, and opened the front door for Sadie.
The house was quiet and still. A big man was asleep on the couch in the living room, draped in an American flag. Sadie disappeared down the hallway to check the rooms. The big man stirred and mumbled.
"What time is it?"
Tex kicked him in the head with his boot.
Who are you? What do you want?"
"I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business."
Katie appeared from outside, and Sadie returned from the hallway with a dark-haired woman in a long white nightgown.
"Another word and you're dead. Where's the fucking money?"
The big man nodded toward a nearby desk. Katie held a knife on him, as Sadie again disappeared down the hallway. She returned this time with a square-looking dude and a pretty blonde woman in her underwear, 8 months pregnant. But the speed can blur your vision, skew the angles, make spots dance in the corner of your eyes, or maybe you just don't see the belly. Maybe you're too focused on the task at hand, or maybe you just lie when you get caught. Tex grabbed her arm and dragged her into the living room. He had enough lucidity to use his elbow to switch off the hallway light so he wouldn't leave any fingerprints, but he still didn't notice she was pregnant. The square was whining that Tex was being too rough with her, so he told Sadie to tie the big man's hands with a towel while he tied the square's hands and feet, pushed him down into a chair, then wrapped the rope around his neck. The ceiling had exposed rafters running the length of the room, so he slung the rope over one and tied the other end to the pretty woman's neck. The square struggled in the chair, shouting at him to be careful with her. She was pregnant.
"I told you, one more word and you're dead."
The speed gives you tunnel vision. It makes you jumpy, skittish, impulsive, so he pointed the .22 and he squeezed. The pretty woman screamed, and the man fell onto the rug, groaning, bleeding, but alive. Sadie searched the house for cash and came back with $70.
"You mean that's all you've got?"
"How much do you want?"
"We want thousands."
There's no money in the house, but we can get more. We just need time.
You know I'm not kidding.
Yes, I know. The square was making too much noise, so Tex kicked him in the face till his eye socket cracked. Then he kneeled down and stabbed him. What are you gonna do with us?
You're all gonna die.
The big man was fighting against his bonds. Kill him!
Sadie came at him with the knife, but he managed to drag her to the ground. She flailed and stabbed his legs once, twice, again, until she lost the knife in the couch cushions and he wrestled her to the ground. Tex didn't have a clear shot without the risk of hitting Sadie, so he jumped into the melee and beat him with the butt of his gun so hard a piece of the grip broke off on his skull. But the big man, somehow, made a break for the door, dragging Tex and Sadie by the rope all the way to the front porch.
Help me! God, help me!
Tex stabbed him again, then shot him twice, and the man finally slumped to the ground and laid still. Linda was standing in the front yard watching, petrified, screaming.
Make it stop. It's too late. The woman in the nightgown, streaked in blood, made a mad dash across the lawn. Someone's getting away. Katie tackled her to the ground and pinned her wrist. She looked up at Tex and Katie, calm, emotionless, and resigned. I give up. You've got me.
Tex didn't know at the time that she had a name, Abigail Folger. He stabbed her 28 times and felt nothing but the warm, sticky blood between his fingers. He looked over his shoulder and saw the big man had somehow dragged himself off the porch and halfway across the lawn. That mother was strong. Tex ran over there and pushed his face into the dirt. He raised the knife and brought it down, again, until he lost sight of his hand beneath the blood. He didn't know the man had a name, Wojciech Frykowski. The coroner's report would say he was stabbed a total of 51 times.
Tex staggered to his feet and headed back to the house with Katie close on his heels. They found Sadie sitting on the couch, clutching the pretty woman while she sobbed, sniffed, and begged. The acid had snapped, crackled, and gone, but the speed was still cranking out the hits. And it wasn't until the woman begged to have her baby before they killed her that Tex finally noticed she was pregnant. He didn't know at the time that this woman had a name, a famous one, Sharon Tate, but he wanted to know that. For a moment, right then, he cared, but as fast as things snapped into focus, killer, they slid back into a blur. Sadie just sat there, frozen, so Tex lunged with the knife. Mother. Again. Mother. Again. Mother. Tex stabbed Sharon Tate 16 times before she finally stopped moving, and everything went quiet. So quiet, they couldn't help but whisper.
Are they all dead?
Yes.
Write something. Write something that'll shock the world.
She picked up the towel and dipped it in the thick pool of red blooming out from Tate's pregnant belly and scrawled the word pig on the front door of the house. They gathered the weapons and ran back to the car where Linda was waiting with the engine on, a ghastly pale, trembling, gasping mess, clenching the wheels so tight her fingers looked like they might snap off at the knuckle.
Drive!
They blew past the gate and disappeared into the death-like quiet of Cielo Drive. They tossed the weapons and bloody clothes as they drove, off cliff sides, into a ravine. Then they stopped at a gas station, checked themselves for blood, and bought gas with the money they'd stolen.
Charlie was waiting for him on the fake movie set boardwalk when they got back to the ranch.
And what are you doing home so early?
They recounted what happened, real messy, just like you asked.
Do you have any remorse?
No.
Okay, go to sleep and don't tell anyone.
He pulled Tex aside as the girls skipped back to the house.
Was it really helter-skelter?
Yeah, it was sure helter-skelter.
Sharon Tate's neighbors would later admit they'd heard gunshots and screams that night, but not one of them came to investigate, called to check, or even called the police. The piggies did nothing, not even to save their own.
The next day, Tex avoided everyone. He just snorted speed and worked on the dune buggies, taking refuge in the quiet of menial work. That night, Charlie called another family meeting. There was too much panic at the Tate house, but tonight would be different. Tex dropped a tab of acid, then he and Sadie snuck off to rail enough crank to maybe make this all okay. They piled into the car and Charlie handed Tex a .45. Tonight, he'd show them how it was done. They stopped at a house in Pasadena first. Charlie and Tex peeked through the windows, but Charlie called it off when he saw photos of children on the walls. He didn't want to kill any kids. Not yet, anyways. The next stop was no good either. Too close to the neighbors.
Someone might hear the screams.
Next up was a church. Charlie wanted to kill the preacher bad, but it was locked up tight. He nixed the next house too. Finally, Charlie gave Tex some directions. Specific directions. Like maybe he had a destination in mind all along. They pulled onto Waverly Drive, and Tex recognized one of the houses from some acid party. But Charlie insisted it wasn't the target. 3301. That's the spot. A place they'd never been. People they didn't know. Pigs, though. Right?
Through the window, Tex and Charlie saw a heavy-set man asleep on the couch with a newspaper draped over his face. The back door was unlocked, so they quietly pushed it open and found a big dog waiting on the other side. Maybe the dog was just a bit too friendly, or maybe Texans just have a way with dogs, but it wagged its tail and licked Tex's hand, nuzzling in for some pets as they shut the door behind them. Charlie pulled the .45, and Tex brandished a bayonet he'd picked up at the Army surplus store. They crept over to the couch, and Charlie pushed the muzzle of the gun into the man's chest. As he brushed the paper off his face and his predicament sunk into his dilated eyes, Tex had a sour flash of deja vu.
Who are you? What do you want?
Or maybe it was just the acid crackling through his bones and radiating out through his nerves.
Tex watched the man's eyes hike up the barrel to meet Charlie's crooked smile.
We're not gonna hurt you. Just relax. Don't be afraid.
How can I help being afraid when you've got a gun pointed at me?
It's okay. I'm your friend. We don't want anything but money.
Charlie tore off the man's leather necklace, and Tex used it to bind his hands. Charlie disappeared down the hall and came back a few seconds later with a woman in a blue nightgown, gun pressed to the back of her head.
Don't worry. It's just a simple robbery.
He sat her down next to her husband's feet. Look, we'll give you anything you want. Just tell us.
Do you have any cash?
There was only a few bucks in the man's leather wallet. I can get you more. Just let me take you to the store and you can get as much as you want.
No, we just want what's here.
Charlie took the woman back to the bedroom, put a pillowcase over her head, wrapped the cord of a bedside lamp around her neck to hold it in place, then did the same to her husband. Once the cord was wrapped good and tight, Charlie pocketed the gun and made his way to the front door.
Make sure the girls get to do some of it,
he said over his shoulder.
Both of them. A few minutes later, Katie and Leslie appeared in the kitchen.
Did he say to kill him?
Tex asked, whispering. They nodded. But acid makes it kinda hard to whisper.
You're gonna kill us, aren't you?
Katie started digging through the drawers for knives. Tex walked over to the sofa and straddled the man. He didn't know the man had a name, Leno LaBianca, and he stabbed him in the throat with the bayonet. The man managed to scream through the blood gushing out of the hole in his neck.
Don't stab me anymore.
Tex watched the bayonet sink into the man's chest and re-emerge again, like a magic trick. Here I am, and then...
I'm dead,
Leno said, through the deep red puddle on the pillowcase where his mouth should be. What are you doing to my husband?
Tex had nearly forgotten about her. He and the girls rushed into the bedroom where they found the woman in a corner, pillowcase still covering her face, obscuring her humanity in a way that suited the acid just fine. The cord was still tight around her throat and she was blindly swinging the lamp around in a broad arc, but the bayonet had range and soon found purchase between her ribs. Tex thrust it in and out like magic, again, until she was dead, and then again, and again. Her name was Rosemary LaBianca, and Tex didn't give a good goddamn.
He's still alive.
He left the woman in a pool of gore and scrambled into the living room, where the speed and acid throbbed and vibed together, Charlie's voice replaying like a chorus, ricocheting around his skull and ripping through his brain.
Make it as gruesome as you can.
He got on top of the man and stabbed him 12 times before he finally went still. He dragged the tip of the bayonet down to the man's stomach and carved war into the soft belly flesh. Tex washed the blood off his hands in the kitchen sink while Katie pulled an ivory-handled fork from one of the drawers. She stabbed the man's corpse 14 times and left the fork jutting out of his stomach. She went back to the kitchen and grabbed a steak knife, then buried it halfway through his neck like she was planting a flag.
Tex went back to the bedroom with Leslie. Charlie wanted the girls to get some too, and it wasn't too late. Leslie was scared. She didn't want to, but Tex pressed the bayonet into her hand and let Charlie, the never-ending intrusive thought, do the rest. Leslie swallowed her fear and doubt and stabbed the woman's corpse 16 times. Their search for cash turned up nothing but a bag of coins. Leslie wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls in blood. Katie misspelled Helter Skelter on the refrigerator door. They wiped everything down for prints, grabbed some milk and cheese from the fridge, and gave the dog a pet on the way out. According to Tex, the LaBianca's dog had followed them through the house the entire time, wagging its tail and just happy to make new friends.
The shock and savagery of the murders threw Hollywood into a state of panic. Frank Sinatra was rumored to be in hiding, and Mia Farrow was afraid she might be next. The going rate for guard dogs spiked eightfold, and a Beverly Hills sporting goods store reportedly sold 200 guns in just 2 days. Fear had fallen on the City of Angels, and the piggies were running scared. The wall-to-wall media coverage was a non-stop deluge of wild speculation and tabloid trash. Even Time magazine exaggerated the lurid details to the level of urban legend. But for all the glossy reams of torture porn and conspiracy theories flying off the newsstands, nobody mentioned anything about a Beatles-themed race war. Helter Skelter, it seemed, wasn't coming down fast enough. And Charlie wasn't a man known for his patience. He was never going to stop. He'd make them keep killing, night after night, until one of the races made a move. And Tex didn't know how much more he could take.
Rich called the ranch the next day to tell Tex that his mom had called looking for him. She hadn't heard from her son in 6 months, and she was even more worried than usual, especially with these satanic killers on the loose out there. Tex's heart dropped to his boots. I wasn't sure which was truly worse. The cops having him dead to rights on multiple homicide, or them telling his mom and dad. Charlie told him to call her back and find out what's happening, but he couldn't bring himself to pick up the phone, so he lied. He told Charlie the FBI came to his parents' house looking for him, and he had to hide out somewhere, lay low until the heat was off. Charlie bought it, and within a couple of days, they and a handful of trusted family members loaded up the truck and rode out to Death Valley.
I sometimes wonder,
Tex wrote,
how many more deaths there might have been if it hadn't been for that phone call from Texas.
They spent days out in the desert, rationing water and crawling through abandoned mine shafts, hoping to find the entrance to the pit. At night they dropped acid and watched the campfire pulse and sink with their every breath, sparks and embers dancing on the blades of knives, afraid of nothing and no one, everyone, and everything.
When supplies started running low, Charlie sent Tex and the underage family members out to an isolated, derelict ranch in Death Valley and told them to keep quiet and stay put until things cooled off. It was lonely, scary, and more than a little uncomfortable. And after a couple days of playing creepy babysitter, Tex needed a night out. He hitched 16 hours to LA and just wandered around, laughing at the ridiculous tabloid headlines about the so-called devil-worshipping cult of murderers that was terrorizing the city. He'd never been to a killer black magic sex orgy, but what the hell, sounds kind of fun. The media didn't know shit, but still, seeing all that button-down pearl clutching got him thinking about his family back home. For a second there, he considered calling his parents, asking for a plane ticket back to Texas. But home would be the first place the cops would come looking.
As Tex was hitching back to the desert hideout, the LAPD was descending on Spawn Ranch. They'd found the gutted Volkswagen Katie left in the ravine and executed an arrest warrant on Charlie and some of the girls for GTA. But the pigs botched the paperwork and had to let everyone go the next day. Charlie knew there was no way they'd get that lucky again. It was time to cash in their chips before the dice went cold. He ordered Tex and the family to pack up the whole operation and move it gun by gun, buggy by buggy, out to yet another abandoned ranch he'd found somewhere in the desert. They kept watch from the hills all night, every night for 2 weeks. National park rangers were combing the desert looking for them, and worse, they'd run out of acid.
That night, Charlie handed Tex a shotgun.
Get up to the attic and wait. When those 2 rangers come, kill them.
Charlie peeled out and disappeared in a cloud of dust, and Tex did as he was told, like he always did, always had, and always swore he'd never do.
He woke up the next morning cradling the gun, parched, sore, and slowly piecing together where he was and what he'd been reduced to. He hadn't been this sober in God knows how long, and a rush of feelings he'd long since forgotten how to feel flooded back all at once into his throbbing skull. Regret, remorse, reality.
Suddenly I knew the world wasn't gonna end. Suddenly I was tired and hungry. Suddenly I didn't care what Charlie had told me to do. All I knew was that I wouldn't kill anyone. Not again.
He tossed the gun, bolted down the stairs, and tore off in one of the cars. If he could make it to Ballarat, the closest town, he'd survive, at least until Charlie caught up to him.
2/3 of the way there, the car sputtered and lurched to a stop. He was out of gas and out of water, and the blistering heat of the desert sun cooked flesh like hellfire. There was no turning back. He was hoofing it to Ballarat, to freedom, or to whatever ditch he'd die in when the thirst finally cut him down.
The buzzards were already circling the skies when Tex caught sight of a Jeep on the horizon and waved it down. It was an old man headed out LA way, and he said Tex was welcome to hitch along. The ride very likely saved his life. When they got downtown, Tex thanked the man, stumbled up to the first payphone he saw, and dropped a dime.
Mom, I want to go home.
She wired him enough money for fresh clothes, a shower, a haircut, and a plane ticket. By 5 a.m., he was rushing into his sister's arms in the terminal at Dallas Love Field. She kissed his cheek, cradled his face, and said, quote, "That haircut is still too long for Texas." She took his hand and dragged him to the airport shops, where she told the barber on duty, quote, "Make him look like a boy this time." It was Texas, all right. He was finally home.
The sun was coming up as they pulled into their parents' house, and Tex was crashing hard off the drugs, exhaustion, and Charlie. And the withdrawal was hell. He spent the first few days watching TV in the dark, lying on the couch, barely able to eat, and refusing to speak to his worried parents except to scream at them to please just shut the hell up. It wasn't them, but it was, in a way, definitely. But not really, not at all.
He screamed into pillows, slapped himself in the face. Nothing made sense anymore, and it wouldn't go away.
Was Charlie right?
He wrote,
Were these people I call my parents really pigs? Or was everything my parents and their simple, honest lives represented the real truth?
Once he started feeling a little better, a little more human, he told his parents he needed to go back to LA to collect insurance money, he said. They drove him out to the airport, where he hopped on a plane to Mexico and wandered around, just trying to figure it all out. Then it was a cheap motel in Venice Beach, then passing out under a beach canoe somewhere in Hawaii, then back to LA, where he bought some acid and a cassette of Abbey Road to help keep himself entertained on the long walk through the desert, back to Charlie. About halfway through the trip, or trips, it occurred to him just what the hell he was doing. He'd abandoned his post, disobeyed Charlie, betrayed the family. He was a traitor, a deserter. If he went back, Charlie would kill him right there on the spot, just as bad as you've ever seen.
He spun on the heels of his ragged boots and hiked fast towards the city. After a few hours, or maybe a few minutes, who knew, he spotted the trailer home of an old prospector he'd met a few times before, a man named Tex. It was 2 a.m., but the light was on, so he staggered up and knocked. Despite the hour, the elder Tex seemed glad to see him. He said Charlie and the others had gone and gotten themselves arrested again, but he wasn't sure why. Seemed real serious, though. Arson, maybe.
"Yeah, you'd better get out of the area, quick as you can,"
he said, grabbing his boots. The old man helped him into his truck and drove him all the way out to Ridgecrest, where Tex thanked him profusely and went looking for a payphone. This time his parents made him promise he'd stay for good and mean it. He did, and he would, at least until that promise was no longer his to keep.
He spent November of 1969 reacclimating to life in Texas, right back where he started, working at his father's store, dodging questions from his family, and lying. And then one day, he came home to find his dad and uncle waiting for him, their faces straining to hold composure over the contortions of pain, disappointment, and anger. And he knew the running was finally over.
Charles, you know anything about a murder in California?
He denied it flatly and robotically, and walked right past them into the kitchen where his mother was slaving over dinner, like she always was.
You know what? They're trying to get me for some kind of murder out in California.
It can't be so, Charles. Did you have a fight maybe, and the boy could have died after you left or something?
When he looked her in the eyes, suddenly God, Santa, Charlie, nothing and no one meant a damn thing, and they never did. She was his mother.
I didn't kill anybody.
And lying never felt so fucking wrong.
He flushed his stash of weed and acid down the toilet and put on his best church clothes. The family piled into the car for a trip up to McKinney to have a chat with the Collin County Sheriff, who happened to be his second cousin. When they arrived at the jail, his cousin told him that he was under strict orders to hold Charles as a wanted and dangerous man.
"I think we'll be able to clear all this up quick enough,"
he said, smiling.
We know for sure you didn't commit no murder.
But the rest of the world wasn't so easily convinced. The media descended like buzzards on blood, swarming the jail in shifts, day and night, and interviewing anyone who didn't recoil from the mic shoved in their face. In a lot of ways, Texas itself became the story behind the story. 6 years after the assassination of a president, that backwater state was making headlines again, and the world wanted answers. They wanted to know how a quaint Norman Rockwell town like Coatesville could possibly breed such horror, and just how much more of it Texas might be harboring.
The nonstop media coverage treated his family like camera fodder, collateral damage in the war for primetime ratings. Within days, his father had painted over the Watson family name on the storefront that had taken him a lifetime to build. They, his own family, had become the final victims of the killer they called Tex Watson. The media were willing accomplices in their suffering, but that didn't matter. He was the one who held the knife. But they stood by him despite it all and hired a friend of the family, Bill Boyd, to handle his case. Long before the Texas Hammer and the strong arm of the law became fixtures of rabbit-eared daytime TV, Bill Boyd was the quintessential Texan defense attorney, and they were lucky to have him. The state of California had just issued an arrest warrant and a demand for the immediate extradition of Charles Denton Watson on 7 counts of first-degree murder. Tex had maintained his innocence to everyone up to that point, but once he sat down with the lawyer in private, he broke down.
There was one thing that happened in California,
He told him.
I was sort of involved in the killings.
We're gonna need to talk.
Boyd replied.
A lot.
Boyd was a staunch believer that every American, guilty or not, deserved a fair trial, and he fought the extradition tooth and nail. He kept appealing, and each denial bought Tex 2 more months in Texas.
Stalling for time gave them a chance to see what the other family members would cop to at their trial, and sure enough, Sadie came through. She relished all the attention she was getting and gleefully claimed sole credit for killing Sharon Tate, even bragging that she tasted her blood. The confession struck one murder off Tex's rap sheet and distracted the cameras, for a little while at least.
The longer he kept me in Texas,
Tex wrote.
the longer it would be before I had to face whatever was coming.
He wasn't exactly uncomfortable during his stay in county. Tex denies getting special treatment in jail, but having a cousin in the sheriff's office probably didn't hurt.
You know, I'm the boy's second cousin.
The sheriff told reporters.
His mother's daddy's my daddy's brother, but I don't think they've ever established that Charles was in the Tate house, or that other place either. And this boy is raised in the church house, while his mother and dad are the finest people you'd ever meet. It's awful hard for people around here to think he could ever done the stuff he'd been accused of doing. He's a good boy.
We're happy to say neither of us has ever seen the inside of the Collin County Jail, knock on wood. But we're willing to bet most inmates don't get to keep their TV, radio, Walkman, and Beatles tapes in their own private cells. Still, there was more to it than just having kin in high places. Damn near everyone, his family, the jailers, the locals, and folks all over the state, were convinced he was innocent.
There just wasn't any way a good old hometown boy like Charles Watson, high school football star, honor student, handsome, polite, God-fearing kid with a bright future ahead of him, could ever do the things they said he'd done. Those people. The condescending, big city coastal elite with their Hollywood millions and ivory towers, they think they know it all. Those commie-coddling, race-mixing, drugged-out hippies and their godless pinko sex parties, those Californians, they got the wrong guy, but they can't admit it. They probably set the whole thing up. One of their own devil-loving sissy freaks made a mess of things, and they go and pin it on a red-blooded Texan boy who loves his mama, God, and the US of A.
Even if they did think he was guilty, that wasn't the point. For a lot of Texans, it was a matter of principle. It wasn't about justice for the victims or punishment for the killers. It was about telling liberal America to sit on it and spin.
But even Texan indignation ain't got nothing on a mother's love. Tex confessed to her multiple times, screaming in her face, spitting vile, lurid details of his crimes through the prison bars, trying to hurt her, trying to make her accept reality, to make her see the blood on his hands, but she couldn't. All she could see was her little boy, her Charles, and no matter how often or how badly he broke her heart, she'd never give up on him.
And his dad, for his part, held the line against the press.
His mother raised him right,
He said.
All this fluff they're saying about him, I don't understand. It's just a bunch of lies, and he ain't no hippie.
Manson and the girls sent Tex letters in jail, dark, cryptic ramblings about helter-skelter, and pages of delusional nonsense. Charlie Manson was 1,400 miles away, locked up and headed for trial. But not even that was enough to keep him from burrowing back into Tex's brain and triggering torturous acid flashbacks that kept him up at night or haunting his dreams till he woke up screaming. Boyd's fight against extradition went on for another 9 months and made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. He argued that the entire state of California was too biased and prejudiced to give Charles Denton Watson a fair trial. Vince Bugliosi, prosecutor and author of the book Helter Skelter, said at the time,
"The condition of the judicial system in Texas is nothing short of shameful. It's calculated to frustrate the due administration of justice. Shameful isn't strong enough. It's disgraceful."
And the Supreme Court agreed. In September of 1970, he was transferred to a cell in an LA prison where one of the family members was housed on the floor above, constantly screaming down at his so-called brother to keep hope alive.
Coming down soon!
I began tasting the reality of what I'd actually done in those 2 nights of blood.
Tex wrote,
Suddenly they were not nameless, impersonal things, not pigs. They were terrified men and women who had begged to be allowed to live. And I battered and stabbed and shot the life out of them without mercy.
He threw his body into the prison bars, screaming wildly, refusing to eat. It wasn't until he'd lost 50 pounds to starvation that they finally transferred him to the hospital ward, where they restrained his limbs and forced a feeding tube down his nose. But he couldn't hold it down. He lay there writhing and vomiting, struggling not to drown in his own bile and blood. The court sent 3 different psychiatrists to evaluate him, and each one reached the same conclusion. The prisoner was unable to speak. He was regressing to a fetal state, and without intervention, he was going to die. The prisoner was incapable of standing trial. Charles Denton Watson, they said, was insane.
He was committed to Atascadero State Hospital for evaluation on Halloween Day 1971. And as the prison bus roared past the bright orange sea of pumpkin fields, bittersweet waves of nostalgia swept over him. And he knew at that moment that for the next 90 days, if not the next 90 years, this was the closest to happy he was ever going to feel. Once he'd regained enough strength to go from the tube to spoon feeding, they transferred him to a tiny room with nothing but a mattress on the floor and a hole in the ground for a toilet. And then the interrogations began.
Whether any of this is true, we'll likely never know. But what Tex describes is nothing less than state-sanctioned physical and psychological torture. After 3 weeks of the so-called interrogations, he blurted out that Charlie had programmed him to kill everyone on any day, even you. It was the truth, but the doctor didn't take it for the rhetorical example Tex claims it was. He turned to the orderlies and shouted,
"He just threatened to kill me! You heard him!"
Whether it was genuine fear for his safety or the excuse he'd been waiting for, we'll never know. But the orderlies swooped in, stripped Tex down to his socks and underwear, and threw him back into his cold, empty cell with nothing but a thin blanket to sleep on.
"My strongest memory of the place,"
he wrote,
"is shivering in the dark."
The hospital staff was convinced that it was all an act, that he was starving himself to the brink of death so he might look too sick for trial. He claims some of the orderlies dragged him into an empty room, shoved a piece of beef in his face, and when he refused to eat it, they beat him until the world went black. He awoke on a gurney, naked except for an oxygen mask, while the orderlies searched his body for incriminating bruises.
The hospital psychiatrist would later tell the court that the marks were a normal part of what he called wrestling therapy to help him deal with his aggression. Tex claims he wasn't the only victim of what he called therapeutic beatings. He said it happened to patients all the time. At Atascadero State Hospital, it was standard practice. Once his weight was back up to 128, they bussed him to LA County Jail, and a few days later, he got a visit from some members of the so-called family. They had ragged X's freshly carved into their foreheads. They said it was an act of solidarity. The court had allowed Manson to act as his own attorney, but after he lunged at the judge and threatened to cut his head off while the girls chanted in Latin, they decided, yeah, maybe not. So he carved an X into his forehead in protest, claiming he'd been, quote,
X'd out of society by the establishment.
Rumor has it, the judge started packing a revolver under his robes. After the visit, Tex told the jailers he never wanted to see the family again.
The trial was, for lack of a better term, a shit show. Charlie and the family made themselves a constant spectacle, not exactly helping their case. The tabloids ran wild, and even President Nixon weighed in, preemptively declaring Manson's guilt before the verdict was even in, nearly causing a mistrial and defying all established norms without precedent and without rival, until, well, now. On March 29, 1971, Charles Manson, Susan Sadie Atkins, Leslie Kasabian, and Patricia Katie Krenwinkel were found guilty of first-degree murder. Charlie had never personally killed anyone, but the jury decided he had so much psychological control over the family that through them, he effectively held the knives. There wasn't any use speculating about the sentencing phase. In California, the punishment for first-degree murder was stark and clear: death by gas chamber.
A handful of family members were holding constant vigil outside the courthouse for days, waiting for the verdict. And when it finally came down, they stared wide-eyed into the camera lens and spoke directly to all the piggies of the world.
Death? Death? That's what you're all gonna get.
On May 10th, 1971, Charles Denton Watson pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His lawyer was convinced he could get the charge reduced to second-degree murder, if not get him fully acquitted via hospitalization. Tex spent the summer under intense psychiatric evaluation, reading the Bible whenever he was left to himself. His whole life he'd been searching for something to fill that deep, dark emptiness inside him, and for a while, he truly believed Charlie Manson was the missing piece that could make him whole. But as he stared down the gas chamber, he saw the light at the end of death row.
My horrors were part of a larger horror, a whole world gone wrong, that in no way took away my responsibility for what I'd done, what I'd allowed myself to become, but it explained why. When I'd opened myself to whatever was around me in this broken world, what flooded the emptiness inside me was demonic and deadly. I was barely human anymore. God could heal what I'd done to myself. There could be light, even in my darkness.
And Charles Denton Watson knew in his heart he had to go all in. His mom attended every day of the trial, suffering in anguish and horror as the facts, one after another, undeniable and damning, were laid bare for all to see. But her love, like God's, was boundless. When she walked up to the defense table to hug her son, he recoiled away. He was trying selfishly to spare himself the emotional pain, so she instead, selflessly, shouldered it all for the both of them. She'd used the family's meager savings to rent a tiny apartment halfway between the courthouse and the closest Methodist church, walking every day to the trial proceedings and every Sunday to service. And at both places, she found herself rejected, scorned, and turned away. She visited him in jail at every opportunity, offering her support, encouragement, and love, but Tex barely spoke to her. He just pushed her away. Before long, she started wearing dark sunglasses to hide her tears. The pastor at the church snubbed her just the same, wanting nothing to do with the mother of a murderer. And we gotta admit, we teared up a little when we read her meek, humble, and heartbreakingly Texan response to the preacher's callousness.
Well, I guess city Methodists just aren't like the country Methodists back home.
She even took the stand as a character witness, pleading with the judge, the jury, and the American people to spare this killer that stood before them, because somewhere inside this monster beat the heart of the son she loved more than life itself. But those people, refused to forgive. The media buzzards had long since torn apart the all-American Norman Rockwell facade and left the public perception of Texas and all it wrought out to bleach in the Death Valley sun.
Sensing that it was a losing battle, his lawyer tried at the last minute to pin everything on Linda as the real mastermind, the real killer, saying, quote,
While Charles Denton Watson was in high school back in Texas playing football, what was Linda Kasabian doing? She was going from commune to commune, traveling from man to man, living off boyfriends, shooting speed, selling drugs, and just living by her wits.
And honestly, if the trial had been held in Texas, it might have worked. But Charles Watson was a long way from home.
On October 12, 1971, he was found guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. It only took 2.5 hours for the jury to conclude that he was perfectly sane, that he knew good and well the difference between right and wrong. And 9 days later, they sentenced him to die at the hands of the state in front of an audience as he choked to death on poison gas.
Tex was led past his sobbing mother and father, out of the courtroom and into a cell at San Quentin's death row with Charlie. And together, alone, they waited to die. But on February 18, 1972, the California Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional, and they, with the rest of the family, were transferred into general population. It was then that Tex recognized for the first time that his relationship with God was one-sided. It was all about what he got, not what he gave. He needed to serve. He had to go all in. Before long, the Department of Corrections decided it was in everyone's best interest to separate him from other members of the family, so they transferred him to California Men's Colony. It was a progressive, reformative place with decent amenities, low violence, and even conjugal visits. Like Scandinavian prisons, the inmates had rooms to themselves instead of cells, and they were allowed to carry their own keys. He even got a job at the prison pharmacy, which is pretty impressive given his track record. He got married to a woman he'd met during the trial, fathered 4 children, divorced, and eventually founded his own prison ministry he calls Abounding Love. Charles Manson recorded a couple of surprisingly decent acoustic albums in jail, ranted and danced at every camera he saw, and ironically became the subhuman sex property of a neo-Nazi prison gang. He finally died in prison in 2017.
Charles Denton Watson has now been in prison for 48 years. Suzanne Struthers, the daughter of victim Rosemary LaBianca, and Susan LaBerge, the daughter of victims Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, have become unlikely but vocal advocates for his release as a reformed man. Despite their efforts, his parole's been denied 17 times. His next hearing comes up in 2021. He'll be 75 years old. And maybe, if he's lucky, Texas will finally call him home. By almost any objective measure, no one in the family has more literal blood on their hands than Tex Watson. But in almost every depiction of those 2 summer nights in 1969, he's treated like a pop history footnote, basically just scary murderer number 3 in Charlie's psychosexual slasher flick. But everyone knows the name Charles Manson. There's just something about the guy.
Up until the mid-20th century, the word cult was mostly used by hardline Christians to describe splinter groups that were too divergent from church orthodoxy to qualify as legit sects or denominations. The Quakers or Mormons, for example. There'd been a vocal counter-cult movement in evangelical circles for decades at that point. But like we said, the 60s and the explosion of New Age spirituality changed everything. Teenagers back then, just like teens now and forever, glommed onto the newest, edgiest social trends. But even the more secular parents freaked out when their son came home from school one day wearing a tie-dyed dress and then frolicking around with finger tambourines. You're more than welcome to subtext the shit out of that, of course. But it was a fad, a phase. They'd grow out of it, they said. But mom and dad just didn't understand.
As the counterculture was going spiritual, the counter-cult movement was going mainstream, and the Manson family murders were the perfect manifestation of America's every unfounded fear. The savagery of the carnage, the drugs, the sex, the antisocial, anti-capitalist messages scrawled in blood, the depravity of it all. Any right-thinking American had no choice but to admit that the tabloids had been right. This was nothing short of demonic, satanic. Manson's wide-eyed, piercing stare has become synonymous with evil in America, and it still is. Seriously, go show any high schooler a photo of Charlie Manson and a photo of the vice president. See which one they recognize immediately, and which one they guess might be maybe some 90s movie vampire priest, an emotionally unavailable soccer coach, some cop's stepdad? Anyway.
Tex Watson may not be a household name, but in a decade that saw a presidential assassination in Dallas and the country's first mass school shooting in Austin, the public perception of Texas was already shot to hell. And Tex Watson was just further proof that beneath the romantic cowboy veneer lurked a backwoods breeding ground of terror. And the ripple effect had coursed through the state's cultural history from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Ted Cruz. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
When the verdict in the Manson trial came down, Sadie Atkins spun around in her chair, looked the jury in the eyes, and shrieked, "Better lock your doors and watch your own kids!" And those screams struck a frayed nerve in the collective consciousness and conscience of America. They couldn't shake the image of these beautiful young girls from Midwestern middle-class white families, drugged and brainwashed by the siren call of California heathenry, warped and corrupted by everything real America feared, hated, and made no effort to understand.
The word cult took on a new meaning, a small group of people completely beholden to a dangerous leader, one who separates them from their families, poisons them against outsiders, demonizes dissenters and critics, and demands unquestioning loyalty, devotion, and obedience. And that only makes Charlie Manson's quip to Rolling Stone in 1970 seem even more relevant and prescient today.
I'm just a mirror,
He said.
Anything you see in me is you.
It was September 1975, and things had changed a lot for Bonnie and Herf since the early days back in Houston. They just held a wildly successful class in Waldport, Oregon, recruiting another 20 crew members for God's spaceship. And for once, it felt like people were actually starting to take them seriously. Maybe too seriously. That same night, the most watched news anchor in America, Walter Cronkite, introduced Bonnie and Herf to primetime. And they learned the hard way that not all publicity is good publicity.
A score of persons from a small Oregon town have disappeared. It's a mystery whether they've been taken on a so-called trip to eternity, or simply been taken.
They'd been praying for years for some real press, but not like this. Police were launching investigations into the so-called disappearances of their new recruits, and journalists were on them like bloodhounds. But worst of all, the media was calling them a UFO cult. The label came with a level of stigma and scrutiny that the two just weren't ready to deal with. And besides, it was unfair. Cult was a pejorative, a slur. They weren't a bunch of drugged-out, knife-wielding crazies. Bonnie and Herf much preferred the recently minted, politically correct nomenclature, New Religious Movement. They were just a group of like-minded, everyday folks on a unique spiritual path. The two could have reached out to the press and set the record straight, sure. But with the cultural climate the way it was, things could go very, very wrong.
They decided it might be best to lay low for a while, so they split up the group, at the time almost 200 people, and sent them out on the road in every direction, scattering the flock from coast to coast and everywhere between. Even Bonnie and Herf themselves were separated for 9 months, corresponding through P.O. boxes whenever they could. When they finally reunited in Wyoming in June 1976, not everyone showed up, and paranoia got the better of them. The two declared that the, quote, recruitment phase was complete, and turned their attention to what Bonnie called clarifying the butter. In other words, culling the doubters. Anyone caught smoking weed or having sex was out, and, as you might expect, their numbers started dwindling pretty fast. Bonnie and Herf rechristened themselves after notes on the musical scale, T and Do, and spent the next 3 years moving back and forth between campsites, summering in Colorado and waiting out the winters in Texas. But living outdoors, constantly on the move, scrounging for scraps and panhandling for pennies, whittled their numbers down to 40. And if they didn't make a change, and fast, the rest of their acolytes would turn apostates soon enough.
And then Jonestown happened. Jim Jones, the leader of an offshoot church known as the People's Temple Agricultural Project, had immigrated with his followers to a tiny settlement in Guyana 5 years earlier. Very long story short, things went south, and in November of 1978, they ended up gunning down 5 people, including a US congressman. Jones announced that all hope was lost, and convinced, coerced, or forced his followers to down a mixture of cyanide and off-brand Kool-Aid. He declared, quote,
"We are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act."
909 people died, including Jones himself. It was the largest single incident of American civilian deaths in history, eclipsed only by 9/11. And Jones recorded the entire agonizing thing on tape. It was an unimaginable tragedy, and it only further darkened the stigma around the word cult. Bonnie and Herf were just as horrified as everyone else, but they knew what this meant. The media scrutiny and suspicions of law enforcement were only going to get worse, much worse. The group's morale was sinking fast, and the two did their best to assuage their fears. I mean, surely no one would mistake Heaven's Gate for a deranged suicide cult. Things were looking grim, but like the two always said, God saves. And apparently, so did the parents of their newest recruit, who was more than happy to sign over his trust fund to the cause, about $250,000. So in 1979, they decided to invest in a more stable living situation and rented a complex of houses in suburban Dallas.
Despite some concerns about the light pollution throwing off the spaceship's coordinates, they had more terrestrial things to worry about. Privacy and security were the priority, especially with all those police and private detectives snooping around on behalf of the members' families. But their new home afforded a certain level of protection. In Dallas, groups of the godly still got some benefit of the doubt. A handful of the members used fake names and phony resumes to get jobs, redirecting their reference calls back to Bonnie and Herf, who, of course, gave them glowing reviews. Impropriety aside, they made for great employees. Quiet, punctual, well-groomed, and obedient. Before long, the flock was raking in around $300,000 a year. They shared everything communally, including clothes, and yeah, even underwear. Each and every item was handpicked by Herf and Bonnie, the self-proclaimed masters of mall shopping, who curated a rotating collection of haute couture from their favorite boutiques, Burlington Coat Factory and TJ Maxx. Every day was planned down to the second. How much money they could carry, who they could talk to, what they ate, even the proper circumference of a pancake. Tea and dough were mostly benevolent as far as totalitarian regimes go, but the experimental diets and erratic sleep schedules were a little rough, especially the short-lived and kinda tone-deaf regimen of nothing but dinner rolls and, well, Kool-Aid.
Over the next few years, members came and went. The message continued to evolve, and Bonnie Nettles was getting sick. Despite her years of experience as a nurse, she couldn't bring herself to accept it. The symptoms were there, she ticked every box, but she ignored it, downplayed it, and flat out lied about it to her family, her flock, to Herf, and to herself for as long as she could. But by 1983, she knew the running was finally over. The doctors had to surgically remove one of her eyes in a last-ditch effort to stem the spread of aggressive, untreated cancer. They begged her to undergo treatment, but she wrote them all off as ignorant quacks. She had a destiny, she told them. Of course she was going to die one day, but not here, not like this. The beast was coming for her, and she would face him down, unflinching and unafraid, side by side and hand in hand with her soulmate. The beast would take them, bit by piece by shred, but she and Herf would be there together, in life, in death, and all that came after, and no fiend, devil, or disease could ever tear them apart. By spring of 1985, the cancer had spread throughout her entire body. She was so frail and weak, Herf had to carry her into Parkland Hospital, where he checked her in with a fake name and kept watch by her bedside as the love of his life, and so far beyond, faded away before his eyes. On June 19th, Herf returned home to his followers and told them that Bonnie's work on this level was now complete. She'd abandoned her earthly vehicle, but she would never abandon them. She was their guardian angel now, their guide on this quest to join her on another level, forever, together, where they belonged. In keeping with her dying wishes, Herf scattered her ashes across the serene waters of White Rock Lake, where Texas finally called Bonnie Nettles home to stay.
Later that night, he pulled one of his students aside, trying and failing to choke back his tears.
Am I crazy?
He asked her.
Should I just tell everyone to go home?
She told him no, of course not. He had to press on, like Bonnie would have, still wanted. And he knew she was right. He knew he had to go all in. A darkness fell on Marshall Herf Applewhite that day, and it would never leave him, but he was far from alone beneath that shadow. The fear that had gripped the nation through the worst of the 60s had never truly lifted, and for a lot of Americans it was only growing darker. The lingering distrust and paranoia was a virus, and with every new season came a new mutation. And in the late 70s, it was pandemic. Folks everywhere started locking their doors for the first time. They were warning their children not to talk to strangers and dreading whatever horrors lurked out there in the night. And those horrors were legion. The MPAA had lost its stranglehold on cinema, and for some, movies became too realistic and challenging to bear. Footage from Vietnam brought the war home and right to our living rooms. It was no longer a distant, glorified abstraction. It was raw, visceral, and terrifyingly real. All at once, the skeletons in our cultural closet came tumbling out like an avalanche into the daylight, turning our screens into mirrors, and America recoiled in horror at what it saw staring back. The erosion of traditional gender roles and sexual norms were decried as the mainstreaming of perversion. The women's liberation movement was bringing women into the workforce in droves, and was decried just the same. The Atlantic wrote, "The Manson girls signified innocence corrupted, or worse, a fundamental misunderstanding of what girls are capable of." And for a lot of Americans at that time, there wasn't much difference between a woman holding a briefcase and one holding a knife.
It was also around that time that the FBI was finally making a real effort to crack down on child sexual abuse, something the vast majority of Americans never knew existed, or pretended not to, or considered so vile that to even acknowledge it was to speak its evil into existence. Whatever it was, the rash of prosecutions and publicity made it feel like a new and sudden epidemic. All of that bled together and stirred in with the specter of death biding its time in some Ruski missile silo. And it was only a matter of time before that cultural kerosene once again soaked the kindling beneath the witch's stake. Now it wasn't just the communist spies infiltrating American society. It was satanic sex cults, deranged butchers dressed as birthday clowns, bag-headed maniacs, or worse, attractive white businessmen turned serial killer. All of them monsters, staining our white picket fences in blood. Everywhere you looked, folks were trading God for incense and crystals. Kids were listening to bands like Twisted Sister and rolling dice with too many sides. And women were abandoning their rightful place in the kitchen for meaningful careers and leaving their children in the care of total strangers. The blood-red writing was on the wall. The devil had come to suburbia, and his cultists were among us, masquerading as our neighbors, our colleagues, even our own daughters. And if the richest of Hollywood royalty weren't safe, no one was. This socio-spiritual cancer had to be exorcised before it claimed us all. Someone had to speak up, to speak the hard truths that the politicians, the pinkos, and the mainstream media didn't want you to hear. The witches had to burn. And a celebrity psychologist named Corey Hammond stepped up and cashed in to give those fears a face.
Hammond earned his fame, fortune, and as far as we're concerned, special place in hell by capitalizing on the zeitgeist of paranoia. He was basically the witchfinder general of Reagan country. His theories, expounded on in countless paid lectures all over the country, were sprawling and convoluted to the point of incoherence. But for right now, we'll just say it involved a global cabal of satanic pedophiles who've secretly run the world for generations, working in concert with the CIA, Nazis, imaginary Jewish doctors, Fidel Castro, Albert Einstein, and pretty much everyone Hammond didn't agree with politically or just personally didn't like. And of course, anyone who had the chutzpah to point out just how dumb the whole thing was. He claimed the satanic lefty pedophile syndicate had infiltrated every level of government, academia, Hollywood, and even your own local PTA, in a diabolical plot to turn America's children into brainwashed, devil-worshipping robot sex slaves.
If Hammond's spiel sounds strikingly similar to the memes your creepy alt-right cousin has been spamming all over Facebook lately, well, this is where that all originated. Hammond was patient zero for the autoimmune thought disease of modern conspiracism, and it's even more batshit than you'd think. Hammond and his acolytes sparked a reactionary mass hysteria that would plague America for 2 decades and beyond. It was a primary catalyst for the rise of the modern religious right. It kickstarted a neo-Puritan crusade for artistic censorship, convinced your mom that Halloween candy is full of needles, and ostensibly made it hip to be a square. The hysteria would come to be known as the Satanic Panic, and Texas played a central role in all of it. The stories are incredible and horrifying, but it just wouldn't be right for us to strip it all down to a 5-minute summary, so we're gonna give it a full episode of its own. But for right now, this is what you need to know.
It had been 30 years since Joe McCarthy drank himself to death, But in the 1980s, hunting for witches was back in a big way. And this time it went far beyond Hollywood and Capitol Hill. This time, and we emphasize this time, its arbitrary wrath fell on the booming daycare industry, the enemy du jour for the newly minted moral majority. Allegations of heinous, sometimes supernatural crimes went from whispered gossip to national news overnight. This so-called satanic ritual abuse was a pearl-clutching fever dream of violence, torture, mutilation, rape, and murder. Police stations and PTA meetings were flooded with reports of everything from puppy dog sacrifice to grave-robbing toddlers.
Studies were conducted all over the world, all of them corroborating the same obvious conclusion. It was total horseshit, but it came too late, and the banal, embarrassing truth just wasn't all that palatable to a self-righteous public with a newfound kink for salacious fantasies and pointless outrage. Besides, the alarmists were making money hand over fist, the church collection plates were overflowing, and uptight killjoys everywhere, from Copeville, Texas to the East Wing of the White House, were emboldened and empowered to ruin, censor, and destroy anything and everything that dared to step beyond the red, white, and beige sensibilities of the Gipper and Gore's real America.
The sensational media coverage turned the whole thing into a self-perpetuating cycle of mass hysteria. Therapists and prosecutors blatantly manipulated and coerced kids and adults alike to implicate themselves in crimes that never happened and admit to things that weren't even physically possible. Parents, police, and politicians who bought into it were rewarded with acclaim, fame, power, and cash. But let's save all that for now. That'll be a great episode. So stoked. Anyway.
It's important to know just how widespread and culturally accepted this whole thing was, and that parents and children alike were irreparably traumatized by it. Lives were destroyed, and innocent people went to jail. Some of them are still there. And it's also important to know that one of the first and most impactful cases of the Satanic Panic was the Fuster case of 1985, which was launched and prosecuted by the then state attorney of Dade County, Florida, Janet Reno. Reno was coming up for re-election just as the panic was starting to heat up, and she seized on it to gin up publicity and votes. She presented herself as a, quote, crusader against child abuse, and took up any high-profile case she could find, even if it meant treading on some spurious grounds.
In her first and most famous conviction of the panic, a daycare owner named Frank Fuster received 6 consecutive life sentences, 165 years in prison, minimum, based solely on coerced testimonies and questionable circumstantial evidence. His wife, Ileana, was sentenced to 3 years and then deported to Honduras. The crime likely never happened, and 34 years later, Frank Fuster is still in jail. Reno was one of the first and most effective proponents of the Panic era's signature manipulation tactics, and she sent a lot of people to prison. Many were later exonerated or acquitted on appeal, but some of them weren't so lucky.
At the time, nobody doubted the convictions. After all, the public at large was practically complicit in the whole thing, sweeping aside her dubious methods, conflicts of interest, and supernatural nonsense for the sake of emotional justice. Janet Reno won re-election in a landslide, catapulting her to national prominence and positioning her perfectly as a candidate for high-level political appointment. But all that success came at a big price, and she wasn't the one who'd come to bear the cost.
Victor Hotef left Bulgaria for Los Angeles at the turn of the 20th century to make a new life for himself. He was a washing machine salesman turned self-taught candy maker, and a Messianic Jew turned Seventh-day Adventist. He wasn't a preacher exactly, but he led Bible study groups in his spare time, and he was drawing a decent turnout from his fellow churchgoers. But not everyone was a fan. Complaints about Hotef's unorthodox interpretations of the Book of Revelation were piling up at the offices of SDA leadership, and in 1929, they demanded, politely, that he discontinue his study sessions forthwith and post-haste. But Hotef bucked the order, instead opting to self-publish 5,000 copies of a book he called The Shepherd's Rod, a collection of sermons expounding on his new vision for the Adventist faith, an apocalyptic warning of a coming siege that would end in salvation by fire. He called it prophecy, the church called it heresy.
Victor Hotef was formally disfellowshipped and shunned by all mainline Adventists, but his study group stuck by their prophet. In 1935, he and 37 of his followers packed up and moved out to a 189-acre property just outside of Waco, Texas. It was only a 2-mile walk into town, but it was just far enough to avoid the corrupting influence of urban life. Hotef christened the land Mount Carmel after the biblical mountain in Israel where Elijah is said to have challenged the cultists of Baal to a contest of faith. They would each make a sacrifice to their respective gods, and the winner would be decided by whichever offering spontaneously caught fire and burned. The followers of Baal sacrificed a bull, eviscerating it alive on their altar, but Elijah chose to sacrifice his labor instead, repairing an old, desecrated altar nearby. As the story goes, the newly fixed altar burst into flames, and Elijah watched as all his hard work immolated to ash. But in the end, that was the point. The supremacy of his God had been laid bare for all to see, smoldering before them in glorious ruin.
The shepherd's rod came to Texas at the height of the Great Depression, and while the rest of America was suffocating in dust and famine, Mount Carmel thrived. So much so, they were able to double the size of the property and install water, electric, and sewage systems, even a phone line. They built their own printing press and a multi-level office building to house it. The press made it possible to mass-produce Hotef's tracts, earning him fame, fans, and detractors far and wide. They even printed their own currency. It was part commune, part city-state, part Gilded Age company town. Except everyone actually wanted to be there, and nobody starved.
Hotef formally changed the name of his sect to the Davidians in 1942, claiming it was their destiny to restore the biblical kingdom of David. It might also have something to do with his bid for conscientious objector status, just in case Uncle Sam ever came calling. In less than 2 decades, the Davidians made Mount Carmel into a real home, and they waited patiently for the enemies of God to finally raise their work to ruin. The sooner his wrath came down, the sooner they could all be kneeling in peace before the throne. But Victor Hotef wouldn't live long enough to watch his creation burn. He died suddenly in 1955, blindsiding his followers, and not just because he was in such good health. They literally thought he was immortal. But Hotef's wife, Florence, was ready and willing to rise to the occasion and become the new steward of Victor's Armageddon.
An explosion of suburban sprawl saw the Waco city limits creeping ever closer towards their gates, just like Victor predicted they would. So in 1957, Florence sold the land and everything they built together for God to burn, and she turned a hell of a profit, enough to buy 941 acres about 12 miles outside of town. The Davidians soon broke ground on a new Mount Carmel, on a hilltop reaching up toward heaven from a sea of rolling meadows. As their new home was finally coming together, Florence had a premonition. One so vivid, so intense, it couldn't have been anything short of God-sent revelation. The second coming was upon them. The end of days was nigh. On Easter Sunday, 1959, the first seal would be broken. And thanks to their printing press, word spread fast and far. Upwards of 900 Adventists from all over the country quit their jobs, sold everything they had, and moved to an obscure college town in central Texas to bear witness as their Savior ushered death unto the world.
But the end never came, at least not in the way any of them had hoped. Hundreds of people lost everything on a bad bet, and they scattered out across the country to begin the near hopeless task of rebuilding their entire lives from the tatters. In the wake of what came to be called the Great Disappointment, only 50 Davidians stuck around the compound to pick up the pieces of their shattered faith. And when the collection plates made their next rounds through the pews, they came back with little more than pennies and pocket lint. The church was broke, beyond broke. Mount Carmel's buildings were crumbling from neglect and disrepair, and the back taxes were stacking up by the thousands. Florence saw the writing on the wall, a wall that sooner or later the state was going to tear down and strip for scrap and copper.
So in 1962, Florence and her executive council disbanded the Davidian organization, sold 90% of the land, and each of them walked away with $5,000 cash in hand. She left the remaining 77 acres, including the compound, to her personal lawyer, who immediately posted an eviction notice on the gates. He couldn't sell the property until the remaining Davidians vacated the land, but they ignored the eviction, dragging him to court in 1966. And Benjamin Roden, a Davidian from Odessa by way of Kilgore, was determined to keep him there until he broke. And it worked. After 7 years in litigation hell, Florence's lawyer finally cried uncle and sold the land to Ben Roden for less than half the asking price. Ben returned to the compound and turned over the deed to the Davidian church for a symbolic fee of $1. Mount Carmel rightfully belonged to them all, and Benjamin Roden, it seemed, rightfully belonged in the presidency. He claimed God came to him in the night, lifted him into the air by his pajama pants, and told him that the new name of Jesus Christ was the Branch, or something like that. Maybe now would be as good a time as any for another disclaimer.
This story is a difficult one to tell. It's contentious, disputed, sensitive, and deeply political, and it's taken us months to sift through the dozens of conflicting accounts out there, not to mention the countless hot takes in the media. Even after all that, we feel like we're barely scratching the surface here, and if you're really interested in the story, we sincerely encourage you to look into it for yourself. And if we get anything wrong, just blame literally every media outlet from 1935 to present day. But we'll get into that more in our next disclaimer. Jesus Christ.
Just as God commanded, Ben Roden rechristened the sect the Branch Davidians, and the flock remained unified behind him until his death in 1978. And that's when things got really weird. Ben's wife Lois claimed to have been appointed as successor by her late husband on his deathbed. There weren't any witnesses to corroborate it, but the executive council of the church voted to back her claim to the presidency anyway.
Lois brought a fresh, feminist, and radical perspective, relatively speaking, to the ever-evolving Branch Davidian theology. She declared the Holy Spirit a feminine entity, and she preached that women, just like men, were made in God's image and should therefore be treated as co-equal servants in His church. Some embraced her message with open arms, but others weren't all that cool with their new lady leader putting ideas in their wives' heads about silly things like equality or empowerment. A reactionary faction was forming, and Lois's own son, George, soon took the helm. He was in his 40s, bearded, overweight, and deeply unstable. He wasn't especially well liked on the compound, where folks had taken to calling him Poor George, and just generally regarded him with a mix of annoyance, scorn, and pity. It was no secret that he resented Lois for usurping what he believed to be his birthright, the Branch Davidian presidency, and he wasn't going to let his destiny go without a fight. George was a hulking mass of insecurity, entitlement, and rage, so pretty much exactly the kind of guy you'd expect would lead a sexist rebellion against his own mother.
That said, we want to take a moment to do what the media neglected or refused to do in their reporting, and note that George suffered from Tourette syndrome, which accounts for a lot of the profanity-laced outbursts, facial tics, spitting, and mood swings that colored the perception of his fellow Davidians and the public at large. We think it's unfair to ignore that fact, especially since pretty much every source out there does. But it also doesn't change our official editorial position that George Roden was a total unhinged asshole.
At some point in 1979, George got tired of waiting for his mother to die. He declared himself the rightful leader of the church and called on all true believers to come with him to live on his late dad's land somewhere in Israel. To no one's surprise but his own, there weren't any takers, and the ranks of his faction were growing dangerously thin. George, as you might imagine, wasn't the kind of dude who lets things go. In a petulant fit of vengeance, he tried to sell some of the church land out from under Lois, so she sued him and scored a permanent court injunction, barring him from selling any church assets or ever holding the office of church president. George refused to take it lying down, so he packed up his toys and moved back to California. And that's when a lanky, long-haired stranger in dirty blue jeans and beat-up Chuck Taylors rolled up to the gates of Mount Carmel.
Vernon Howell was born in Houston, Texas in 1959, the year of the Great Disappointment. His mother, Bonnie Sue Clark, was only 15 years old, and his father abandoned them during the pregnancy. She remarried a little too soon, and Vernon's new stepfather started beating him at the age of 2. Bonnie Sue got a divorce as fast as she could and moved up to Dallas to start over, leaving Vernon behind in the care of his alcoholic grandparents until she was stable enough to care for him. He finally rejoined his mother and her new husband at the age of 5, splitting his time between their home in the rural suburbs of North Dallas and the East Texas city of Tyler, where his mom's company had an office. Vernon struggled with dyslexia and a stammer in his speech, and consequently with school in general. Back then, and especially here, schools didn't really have the resources or even the desire to accommodate kids with learning disabilities. Why bother addressing a student's individual needs when you can just dump them in special ed and forget about it?
We can't stress enough how much of a problem this was at the time, and still is today. Kids were, and are, routinely left behind for the sake of convenience, and the psychological damage that can cause can't be overstated. And look, we're not experts and we're not here to preach, but sometimes it's hard not to wonder how different these stories we tell might have turned out if someone, somewhere, took a few moments to really listen to the troubled kid who just desperately needed someone, anyone, to care. But we digress.
Vernon's teachers dismissed him as half-bright, and his classmates took to calling him Mr. Retardo. He was an awkward kid from a broken working-class home, traumatized, abused, and alienated by schoolyard bullies and authority figures alike.
And from an early age, he internalized it. At some point, he had no choice but to assume they were right about him all along. He was stupid. He was a burden, a distraction, a sad statistic, and a lost cause. Everyone said so. How could he not believe it? The bullying and condescension would follow Vernon Howell from kindergarten to high school and, in a way, to his grave. No one wanted him around, so WWJD. In 11th grade, Vernon dropped out of Garland High School and resigned himself to whatever mercy God might have on someone whose very existence was someone else's embarrassing chore. While wandering around in an abandoned barn somewhere in Plano, Vernon found an old guitar beneath the hay and cobwebs, and something just clicked. He started learning some country songs before graduating to rock and roll, and before long he was forming garage bands with some of the other kids in town. But the rock scene was a cesspool of drugs and booze, and there just wasn't any room for Jesus between the rolled bills and razors of a dive bar green room. So Vernon Howell went solo.
Now might be a good time to mention that Vernon was an extremely devout kid. Even his own mother was weirded out by how intensely he enjoyed going to church. He'd memorized entire books from the Bible by the age of 12, and by age 18, he could recite the whole thing, word for word, cover to cover, by heart. His obsessiveness went beyond scripture, though. There was also the girl. She was 16, he was 18, and not even his commitment to God could hold a candle to teenage hormones. It didn't take long for him to shamefully give in to carnal lust. Obviously, the situation wasn't jibing with his hardline beliefs, and he was horrified by his own impulses. There was just no other way to frame it. He couldn't trust himself not to sin. So he drove out to Tyler and stayed with a friend for 2 months in an effort to keep away from the temptation. One night she called him up and told him she was pregnant. He paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and said a line he'd heard in some movie or something.
"I'm sterile."
And she hung up.
But a few weeks later, God spoke to him and told him he was as good as married to her in the eyes of the Lord, and he had to do right by that. He came back to Dallas, but by that point she'd already had an abortion. He was heartbroken, and she was all mixed up about it, but they started hanging out again anyway. One thing led to another, and she got pregnant again, but this time, her dad ran him out of the house and out of her life for good.
He spent weeks sleeping in his truck on the outskirts of Dallas until God spoke to him once again. He told Vernon it was time to stop dwelling and start serving.
And all of a sudden, everything was like bang,
He said,
it hits me all at once. Oh, what an ability to forget the reasons and purposes of life. But the keynote is this: God said he would give her to me later.
He moved back to Tyler and joined the local Seventh-day Adventist church, his mother's faith. But at age 22, he told the preacher that God had given him permission to marry his 15-year-old daughter, and the preacher didn't take that so well. Vernon was more or less run out of town, so he hit the road, southbound. One afternoon in 1981, Vernon Howell found himself in Elk, Texas, just outside of Waco, and walking up to the gates of Mount Carmel.
I was just a bonehead coming to see what was going on.
And, bonehead or not, they embraced him as one of their own.
Lois Roden took him in as a pupil and her personal driver, and within weeks he was leading Bible studies for a rapt audience. Whenever he came to the pulpit, often with a 5 o'clock shadow and motor oil stains on his shoes, he didn't sermonize, he conversated. And it was enthralling. There was just something about the guy. A few months later, Vernon started staying in Lois's room at night, which raised some eyebrows, though he claimed they were just having private theological discussions. He later confessed to an affair in which he tried to impregnate her. Lois was long past menopause, but he believed in a miracle so hard she was willing to feign a miscarriage. A fair amount of the Davidians were more than a little creeped out by the 40-year age gap and the out-of-wedlock relations, but no one more so than George. George Roden hated Vernon Howell from the moment he laid eyes on him, and you can probably imagine how he took it when his mother started laying a lot more than eyes on that scrawny little creep. And the rest of the Davidians were starting to choose sides.
So when the administration building burned down in 1983, destroying the printing press and causing $500,000 in damages, George immediately cast the blame on Vernon. And he wasn't the only one. Several eyewitnesses came forward claiming to have seen Vernon light the blaze, but the factions were so polarized, no one in Vernon's camp was willing to believe it. The following year, Vernon asked Lois to marry him. She agreed, and instead of exchanging rings, she put a $700 gold chain around his neck when they gave their vows. Later that night, according to George's wife, Amo, Vernon draped the same necklace around the neck of a 14-year-old girl named Rachel Jones, claiming her as his polygamous second wife. Lois allegedly snatched the chain off the girl's neck the next day, but neither left him, and everyone at Mount Carmel was more than a little uneasy about the whole thing.
George moved back from California and announced an election for the church presidency. He won, and Vernon tried to push Lois to take it to court, citing the injunction. But she was more interested in traveling in her twilight years. Let the boys fight it out. George sued Vernon for raping his mother, and lost. Meanwhile, Vernon's followers openly chided George and threatened to, quote, horsewhip him. So he started printing tracts that predicted Vernon's violent death, and before long, he was carrying a gun everywhere he went. He finally confronted Vernon in the spring of 1984. By that point, most Davidians were so weirded out by their leader's cradle robbing and potentially compromised position that they were able to hold their nose downwind of George. By the end of the day, Vernon and his followers were evicted from the compound at gunpoint. Vernon led his flock 90 miles east to Palestine, Texas, where they lived in a makeshift compound made of old buses, plywood shanties, and tents. They had no running water or electricity and used plastic buckets for toilets. At first, the locals thought they were just a bunch of dirty hippies. Gross and weird, sure, but harmless enough.
But they wore out their welcome pretty fast. Vernon was sending the children out to collect water from the neighbors' spigots on a near-daily basis, and the sheriff was getting complaints. He sent out a couple of deputies to check things out and pass along a friendly warning. Please don't be hassling the neighbors. Thanks, and y'all have a good night, okay? But Vernon didn't take it so well. He marched down to the office with a church member posing as his attorney and demanded to speak with Sheriff Thomas immediately. But Thomas wasn't the backwoods rube Vernon thought he'd be. It took him all of 2 minutes to call out the fake lawyer and, in the process, learn just about all he needed to know about this Vernon Howell fella. So he sent 2 of his more amiable deputies out to the camp to get friendly with the group and keep an eye on things.
Aside from a one-off run-in with Child Protective Services, the Davidians didn't seem to be up to anything dangerous or illegal, but Sheriff Thomas, and pretty much everyone else, didn't much like the stories they were hearing whispered around town. Something just didn't smell right. But what could they do? If there wasn't any law-breaking, folks, especially white Christian folks, could do whatever they wanted on their own private property. It just ain't nobody else's business. Until it is.
A manager at the local Walmart called up Sheriff Thomas to let him know the Davidians were buying up all the firearms he had in stock. Not that there was anything wrong with that, of course. It's their God-given right as Americans. But just thought you might want to know. Thomas checked in with the local gun store owner, and he too had been doing a hell of a business lately. He said those Davidian folks were in the market for automatic weapons, but they were willing to take whatever they could get their hands on. Sheriff Thomas was rightly concerned, but they weren't technically breaking any laws, so there wasn't anything he could do but wait and see.
Meanwhile, at Mount Carmel, George was having some trouble earning respect as a leader. Turns out forcing people to call the place Rodenville wasn't as popular as he thought it'd be. He was still second in command to Lois, but she wasn't going to live forever, God willing. He needed to prove himself somehow, show the flock that he'd make a strong, capable president. So, for whatever reason, he decided it was a good idea to invite a local news camera crew out to the compound, ostensibly to tour the grounds and show the world that the Branch Davidians were lovely, productive, pious citizens just like everyone else. Naturally, he spent most of the interview waving around an M1 carbine and ranting to the TV audience about some guy they'd never heard of.
It's basically a holy jihad,
he said.
Khomeini versus Israel. That's what Vernon Howell has with me.
The spectacle didn't work out the way George had hoped, and in the preceding weeks, a good number of Davidians left in fear of what he might do, or make them do. He did eventually get one bit of good news, though. His mother Lois finally died, but his ascension to the presidency was still up in the air. After all, his mom did legally bar him from the job, and worse, a lot of his supporters were siphoning away to that twerp Vernon Howell. He had to do something, and fast.
In October 1987, George Roden finally came up with a surefire, totally well-thought-out plan to prove his superiority over his arch-rival once and for all. He snuck into the Davidian cemetery late at night and dug up the grave of an 85-year-old woman named Anna Hughes, who'd been dead for 20 years. He dragged the coffin into the nearby chapel, draped it in a giant Israeli flag, and called up Vernon Howell with a challenge. Whichever man could resurrect the old lady's corpse with his prayers would become God's undisputed president of the Branch Davidians. Vernon was like,
"Yeah, no thanks, dude. Good luck with all that."
George was pissed, but he wasn't going to let that scrawny little mom fondler ruin his brilliant plan. So he spent the rest of the night praying over a putrefying skeleton, expecting it to spring to life any moment now. Spoiler alert, it didn't.
Vernon, meanwhile, had a plan of his own. He called the sheriff's office on Halloween to report the abuse of a corpse. The cops thought it was a prank at first, and even then, it was going to be a busy night for them. But Vernon kept pushing, and they were losing patience. "Look, Mr. Howell, we can't do anything without some real hard evidence. Snap some photos of the body or something, and then maybe we can talk. Y'all take care now. Happy Halloweeny." It wasn't the first or the last time someone would make the mistake of underestimating Vernon Howell.
In the pre-dawn hours of November 3rd, 1987, Vernon and 7 of his followers piled into a truck and drove out to Mount Carmel to get photos of Anna Hughes' earthly remains. Or that was the story, anyway. They were decked out in matching Kmart camo fatigues with black grease smeared under their eyes. And they'd brought along a few dozen assault rifles with 400 rounds of ammunition. And they kind of forgot to bring a camera, so there's that. The posse snuck through the gates and hid out on the grounds till mid-afternoon, when Vernon gave the signal. They swept through the compound, guns raised, quietly warning anyone they saw there might be trouble, just FYI. We're not sure if George was tipped off or he was just hanging around his front yard with a fully loaded, technically legal in Texas, Uzi submachine gun. Both are honestly plausible. But either way, Vernon's boys threw themselves into a ditch and drew a bead on George while he took cover behind a tree.
Okay, so we just gotta say real quick, we're just as well aware as y'all are that our acting skills are not great, but this is seriously how this conversation played out, inflection and all, according to George's wife Amo anyway. She was cooking dinner in the kitchen a few yards away from George's hiding tree when shots rang out. She stuck her head out the front door and shouted,
"George, what the hell's going on out there?"
"There's some men out here shooting at me."
"I'll call the sheriff."
"Well, wait a minute."
George tried to return fire, but the Uzi's magazine jammed and burst, and he effectively shot himself in the chest with a scatter shot of metal shrapnel.
"Hey, George, should we call the sheriff?"
"Yeah, call the sheriff."
Amo hung up the phone and went right back to cooking because she knew, quote, when it was over, people'd be hungry. Yeah, welcome to Texas. The gunfight went on for about half an hour before the deputy showed up and calmly broke it up like it was a low-key bar fight. Vernon and his men were taken downtown and George was taken to the hospital. None of the bullets fired actually hit anyone.
A station wagon rolled up next to the squad cars and 3 more of Vernon's men got out. They walked over to Amo, smiling pleasantly, and introduced themselves by name.
"We've come to take the property over, but don't worry, you can still stay here."
"Get the hell off this property,"
she shouted, loud enough to catch the attention of one of the deputies.
He looked over his shoulder and said,
"Hey lady, don't be making trouble. Just keep it down."
She demanded the cops kick them out, but they basically just sauntered up to the men like they were on a noise complaint from some whiny neighbor. The cops whispered something, the men nodded, smiled politely, and everyone drove off. "Have a nice day, ma'am. Y'all take care now." Back at the station, Sheriff Jack Harwell had to give Vernon the bad news.
"Well, charge has been filed against you, Mr. Howe. You and your boys gotta surrender. I want y'all to bring all the guns you was using in the gunfight."
And they had a lot of them. According to one deputy, Vernon's boys had, quote, enough weapons and ammunition to hold off the entire McLennan County Sheriff's Department, the police department, and the local National Guard. Before the incident could go to trial, George was sentenced to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. During one of his petty, fruitless, and plentiful lawsuits, he'd apparently called the judge a, quote,
"Goddamn tyrant,"
and attempted to curse him with herpes and AIDS. The next day, 30 of Vernon's followers came to seize control of Mount Carmel. They politely called ahead to say they had a court order, but we're not sure if that's true. Amo Roden certainly didn't think it was, but it didn't matter. By dawn, there were armed guards posted at the gates, controlling who came and went from the compound, all in the name of Vernon Howell.
Vernon and the others were charged with attempted murder, and it went to court 5 months later. Every day, the judge and jurors walked into a courtroom packed wall to wall with Branch Davidians. On one side was the attractive and charismatic Vernon, flanked by dozens of supporters. Happy families, cute kids, friends hugging, and just seemingly normal folks. On the other side was George Roden, a scowling, grizzled lowlife, flanked by correctional officers from the McLennan County Jail.
The defense didn't have much trouble selling the court on their narrative. George was a dangerous whack job who claimed he was the Messiah and that he had the supernatural ability to inflict and cure AIDS at will. It didn't help when a Davidian witness testified that George routinely prayed to himself, quote,
"In the name of George B. Roden, amen."
And of course there was his less than stellar track record of laying sex curses on the judiciary. But George was the plaintiff in this case, the victim. So I guess there's something to be said for first impressions.
The prosecution tried to make the case that it was an assassination attempt, citing the bullets lodged in the tree George used for cover. But they didn't have much else to go on. Vernon claimed they were there to take photos of corpse abuse, and they'd only brought the guns as a precaution, given George's obviously unstable mental state. He claimed George shot first, and though he did discharge his weapon in self-defense, he was just aiming at a tree. He'd never actually try to hurt Mr. Roden. The other 7 men insisted they were just firing into the air the whole time, and a stray bullet here and there may or may not have hit the tree 6 inches from George's face.
It's not exactly a strong defense, but the prosecution had a hard time fighting back. As defense attorney Gary Coker put it,
Roden was just such a bad actor. He was bad news.
And that apparently mattered a lot, because at one point the defense actually dragged the coffin of Anna Hughes into the courthouse to admit as evidence. Vernon even had them tie a pink bow around the skeleton's neck to make it presentable for trial. The judge obviously denied the motion, so they left the casket and the rotting corpse inside it in the public courthouse rotunda until they could figure out how the hell they were going to proceed. Finally, a team of 8 men, 6 of them defendants on trial for attempted murder, were allowed to hoist up a 500-pound casket that had no handles and carry it down the courthouse steps to the street, throw it in the back of a van, and presumably return it to wherever it came from. A few of the sources we dug up, no pun intended,
So intended.
even claimed the coffin slipped their grip and tumbled down the stairs.
When the verdict came down 2 weeks later, the 7 followers were found not guilty, but the jury was deadlocked on Vernon. The judge declared a mistrial, and several of the jurors literally rushed over to the defense table to give Vernon a hug. There was definitely something about the guy. As they wrapped things up, Vernon invited the jury and prosecutors out to Mount Carmel for ice cream, and none of the jurors who were interviewed about it later would either confirm or deny that they went, but they totally did. Vernon arranged for the Branch Davidians to repay all 20 years' worth of back taxes on the property, around 60 grand, and the sheriff returned their stockpile of weapons and ammo. Without a felony conviction, they had no right to seizure. Besides, as far as the sheriff was concerned, they weren't hurting nobody. The prosecution declined to pursue further charges, but one of them, El Hadid J. Shabazz, did later say that he, quote, was a black man trying to prosecute 7 white men in a southern town called Waco.
The day after the trial, Vernon's followers moved to Mount Carmel for good, and those who were already there united behind him. George, for his part, decided to put the past behind him. Sort of. After getting out of prison, he moved to Odessa, Texas, and promptly bludgeoned his roommate to death with an axe handle, and then shot him for good measure. George claimed the man had been sent to kill him by Vernon Howell. The jury found him not guilty of murder by reason of insanity, but he couldn't escape his nemesis. It felt like no matter where he went, Vernon still found a way to haunt him. After the trial, George was shipped off to a state hospital in a small North Texas town called Vernon. Under Vernon's leadership, the Branch Davidians became fairly well known and well liked around Waco. Most of them had jobs in town. Some ran businesses, including a respected law office, and a few worked the gun show circuit down in Austin.
Vernon was a staple at local music venues and often took some of the men downtown after Bible study to, quote, kick back, swallow some suds, and play some tunes. And they probably needed a drink, given that Vernon's Bible study sessions tended to run long, like up to 18 hours long. But as one Davidian put it, it was never a bore. Vernon didn't preach so much as talk. He liked to float ideas and theories and interpretations, and he loved a good debate. His conversation over pontification approach made him relatable and approachable, like a teacher you could have a beer with. It was a welcome change for some Seventh-day Adventists, and Christians in general, who were getting a little tired of the same stale thing week after week. Vernon made faith kind of fun and almost cool, as much as it can be anyway. And for his followers, that made his more unorthodox teachings just a little easier to swallow.
He told them he was the Lamb that was written about in the book of Revelation, the only one who could, and would, open the 7 seals. He wasn't claiming to be Jesus. After all, Jesus was a good Christ, a holy Christ. Vernon Howell was, in his own words, a sinful Messiah. Only a sinner, anointed by God, could do what a holy Christ couldn't, spark the flames at the end of creation. But he decided to start small. The SDA Church had extremely strict rules regarding diet, and they flat out forbade alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, even caffeine. With Vernon in charge, beef and chicken were back on the compound's menu, even though most folks chose to stick with abstinence. One woman, who was willing to give it a shot, puked her guts out as soon as the charred flesh hit her tongue. The repeal of prohibition at the compound went pretty much the same way. Only Vernon and the other guys in the band really cared for the taste of beer. He even found a way to justify his new affinity for Marlboro Lights. Psalm 18:8, quote, "Smoke rose from his nostrils."
It was only the first line of the verse, taken wildly out of context, but it worked. And since he knew practically all of the Bible's 31,000 some odd verses by heart, he could justify damn near anything. It was like his mutant ability. But the Bible isn't all cheeseburgers and Marlboros. As he put it, quote,
"The Bible is a whole book about nothing but killing."
In August 1989, Vernon released a new cassette of his teachings, his favorite medium for both song and scripture. And this one was titled The New Light. God had spoken to him once again, and this time he told him, or commanded him, to procreate with all the women and girls in the church. It was the only way to restore the house of David and raise a proper army of God for the end of days. The Lord told him he had to separate all married couples living on the compound and segregate the sexes in their sleeping quarters. The men and boys were to remain celibate. He and only he could have sex with their wives and daughters, and he could do so whenever and however he chose, and the men had no right to protest, but they were welcome to watch.
As the Texas Observer noted, quote, "God, not legislatures, established the age of consent. The residents of Mount Carmel, like thousands of Old Testament Hebrews, believe that once a person is a bona fide mouthpiece for God, he may break the law as God instructs. And somehow, despite whatever doubts, reservations, feelings, or impulses they might have had, nearly all of the Branch Davidians went along with it. Those who refused left the compound, and some the church altogether, and a few went to the authorities. There were accusations of statutory rape, molestation, and abuse of misbehaving children, even infantilizing abuse of misbehaving adults. But the police and child protective services couldn't find any conclusive evidence to back up the claims, even after multiple visits and investigations. Still, Vernon likely fathered as many as 20 children by mothers as young as 14. The word of God was law, and Vernon Howell, conveniently enough, was the only one who could hear it.
He even managed to take his message abroad, recruiting followers in church chapters in Canada, Australia, and the UK, not to mention Hawaii and all over the continental US. But Israel was an especially important target for recruitment. He traveled there several times over the years, convinced it would be ground zero for Victor Hotef's long-prophesied siege at the end of the world. But an ex-member tipped off the authorities and Vernon was formally kicked out of the country. But it was all good, just a mix-up in translation. Armageddon wasn't going to happen on a hill they called a mountain somewhere in Megiddo, Israel. It was going to happen on a hill they called a mountain in Waco, Texas. In 1990, the compound had grown to a community of around 150 believers, and Vernon decided to change his name to better reflect his destiny, or as he justified it at the time, for publicity and business purposes. He chose a name that combined the legacy of King David, the spiritual bloodline of which he claimed to be scion, and the Hebrew name for Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, heathen and sinner, who delivered the Jews from bondage in Babylon, David Koresh.
In the latter half of 1991, Larry Gilbreth had become something of a regular at the compound. Mount Carmel was part of his route as a UPS driver, and the Branch Davidians seemed to be getting more and more mail every day. They were quirky, friendly folks, and by that point he was on a first-name basis with most of them. The guards waved him through the gate with a smile, and their preacher, Mr. Koresh, usually signed for the packages himself. He even chatted up Larry about their shared passion for motorcycles or mechanics and whatnot. The Davidians were a little strange, but to each their own. They were always nice, almost to a fault, and whatever else they had going on, well, that was between them and God. Besides, it's the 90s. People can be a little funky if they feel like it. And who was he to judge? But around New Year's 1992, things at the compound started to change. There were people wearing camouflage and patrolling the grounds. They started having Larry delivered to a small office at the edge of the property that they called the mag bag, where the guard had to call up Koresh for the go-ahead before Larry could even drive up to the compound.
The boxes were getting bigger, heavier, and often listed as COD, cash on delivery, which meant Larry'd end up finishing out his route with upwards of $5,000 stashed somewhere in his truck. His routes could take him anywhere from 200 to 400 miles away, with 100 stops in between, and it was scary to have that kind of cash on him. He always made a point to call his wife Deborah just in case. If anything happened to him, at least she'd know where he'd been. But stranger still, the labels on the boxes weren't the usual personal items he was used to delivering there or anywhere else. They were coming from arms dealers, lots of them. He didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was none of his business. Buying tons of mail-order weapons and having them delivered to your door wasn't illegal in Texas. But it was concerning.
On one such delivery, they didn't have the cash on hand for the COD. He said no worries, he'd just swing back by tomorrow with the package. But hours later, and miles away, a Branch Davidian flagged him down with an envelope full of cash for the box. Larry was understandably freaked out, not just because he'd have to make another call to Deborah and let her know he was carting around a life-endangering amount of money again, but because...
They found me. I said to myself, how do they know how I run my route? Well, that concerned me a little.
In February 1992, he climbed into the back of his truck to grab Mr. Koresh's daily haul. One of the boxes broke open at the bottom, and a half-dozen hand grenade casings clattered onto the floor around his feet. He carefully stuffed them back in the box, taped it shut, and made the delivery. David Koresh met him at the gate with a smile and thanked him by name. The beat-up state of the box didn't seem to bother him at all. When Larry got home, he told Deborah what happened, and they had a hard time sleeping that night. He genuinely liked these people. He didn't want to get them in trouble if they weren't doing anything wrong. But grenades? The next day, Deborah decided to bite the bullet and call the sheriff. She didn't feel like she had a choice. What if they hurt someone or themselves? The sheriff, in turn, called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The ATF immediately launched an investigation, and for the next year, Larry Gilbreth went about his routine like normal, and David Koresh met him at the gate with a smile and thanked him by name every time.
By January of 1993, the ATF had rented out a house across the street from the compound and conducted surveillance on the Branch Davidians 24/7. They even insisted on sending an undercover agent along with Larry on his routes. But he had long hair. He didn't fit the dress code. Larry tried to warn the agents, but they ignored him. When the two of them pulled up to the mag bag, Larry was surprised they even let him in. David Koresh, just like always, smiled, thanked him, and whispered,
Larry, we know they're watching us.
They drove off without incident, but Larry was shaken bad, and the ATF scrapped the undercover operation. Well, that one at least. Larry went back to doing his routes like he always did, like he always had for the past 30 years, until the last week of February, when again everything changed. The top brass at the ATF authorized their agents to take action, to confiscate any illegal weapons, get the dozens of children living in the compound safely into state custody, and arrest David Koresh.
An 80-vehicle convoy, more than a mile long, embarked from their base at Fort Hood, up I-35 toward Waco. It was a lot, and there was a very important, very cynical reason for that. The ATF's director, Stephen Higgins, was suffering some bad publicity for recently surfaced allegations of institutional sexual harassment and racial discrimination, among other controversial misconduct. Not to mention a decades-long history of screw-ups and high-profile calls for the agency's abolition. The ATF was on its last legs, and they needed to prove themselves. But their upcoming budget hearing wasn't the only thing on their minds. They wanted to be a household name, a prestigious, respectable agency like the FBI, but enforcing the Contraband Cigarette Act just wasn't all that sexy. They needed something with a little more pizzazz. Something big.
They could have arrested Koresh quickly, easily, and quietly on one of his daily excursions into town. But instead they saw this situation as an opportunity for PR gold. They filmed everything documentary style. The preparation, the convoy, all of it. Hoping they'd end up with something heroic, dramatic, and entertaining that they could cut into an infomercial for the agency. Something along the lines of the popular TV show, Cops. They were desperate and overconfident. In the last 10 years, they'd only lost one agent in the line of duty, to an accidental explosion of confiscated fireworks.
The preparations for the raid, under Higgins' direction, were more like a Hollywood pre-production than a law enforcement operation. They had news conferences planned out, called ahead to TV outlets, strategically posted camera crews throughout the area, and told ambulances and hospitals to be ready for the big event. The higher-ups called it Operation Trojan Horse, but the agents on the ground called it showtime.
Everything was in place and they were set to serve a search warrant by force on February 28, 1993. They sent in Special Agent Robert Rodriguez, who'd been undercover at the compound for weeks, posing as a recent convert named Robert Gonzalez. They wanted him to reevaluate the situation inside and make sure everything was going as planned. So he went upstairs to talk to Koresh.
The ATF and National Guard are coming,
Koresh said, turning away and walking over to a window overlooking the grounds.
Robert, it's up to you now.
He turned and looked at Robert, who was doing his best to hide his surprise and his fear. He knows. What do you mean? He asked.
Robert, you know what I mean. We know they're coming.
He didn't know what to do. He was supposed to be out of there and behind ATF lines. The raid was set to begin at 9:15, and it was already a few minutes after 9. If Koresh didn't kill him where he stood, his fellow agents firing blindly into the compound might do the job for him. Instead, David Koresh shook his hand.
Good luck, Robert,
he said. As confusing and disturbing as it was in the moment, Robert could tell he meant it. His right-hand man, Steve Schneider, walked Robert politely to the front door.
The FBI would later ask Schneider why they didn't confront Robert if they knew he was an agent all along. He told them, quote,
"We love the guy. I mean, we spent enough time with him where we really do appreciate the man's character and personality."
Steve opened the front door, and Robert made a run for it, worried they might shoot him in the back. They didn't. When he got to the undercover house, he called up his superior on the phone.
"Did you see any weapons?
No.
Was there a call to arms?
No.
What were they doing when you left?"
Praying. He hung up, jumped in his pickup, and floored it to the command center. Maybe there was still time to convince his superiors to just call the whole thing off. Maybe there was still a chance this could all end peacefully and nobody would have to get hurt.
"I was upset because I knew what was going to happen,"
he said. But when he got to the command center, it was abandoned. It was showtime, and he was too late to save them.
February 28th, 1993, 9:45 a.m. Two pickup trucks rolled up to the compound towing cattle trailers covered in canvas tarps and loaded with ATF agents.
"Everything's clear. Windows are clear. Truck 1 and 2. Full speed ahead. Full speed ahead."
But it wasn't clear.
"It's showtime. Showtime. Showtime."
To this day, we still don't know for sure who fired the first shot.
Outside, 35 agents in full SWAT gear fanned out across the property. It was supposed to be a surprise attack, but somehow the Davidians knew they were coming. Whatever plans they had were shredded to ribbons in a rain of bullets. Their cop show fantasy PR stunt had suddenly collapsed into a full-on war zone. But the cameras kept rolling, covering every angle, live and nationwide, as federal agents were cut down and bleeding out in the green-yellow grass. Inside the compound, windows and walls were exploding into shrapnel, shards, and splinters. As the riflemen ducked and fired and ducked again and screamed and bled, women and children huddled for cover as the walls disintegrated around them, the morning sun lighting up the dark through 100 bullet holes, 500, 1,000, until walls became windows and there was nowhere left to hide. Parents scrambling to find their kids and get them to safety, stumbling over debris through plumes of smoke, eyes burning, struggling to breathe, struggling to think in the chaos, confusion, and cacophony of noise. The nonstop barrage of machine gun fire coming in and going out from all directions, everywhere. Flashbang grenades clattering through a sea of broken glass and spent shells, the deafening blast, the blinding lights, the children screaming, everyone screaming.
Most of them never even heard the distorted, mechanical voice from outside.
The ATF will cease fire if they will cease fire and won't pull back.
And suddenly, it was quiet. The only sounds were the cries of the children, the moans of the wounded, and the painful, piercing ring in their ears. Koresh had been shot in the wrist and the side, and he was bleeding bad. He dragged himself to a phone and called his mother. She didn't pick up, so he left a message on her answering machine.
Hello, Mama. It's your boy. They shot me and I'm dying, alright? But I'll be back real soon, okay? I'm sorry you didn't learn the seals, but I'll be merciful, okay? I'll see y'all in the skies.
His prognosis turned out to be a little premature. The women treated the wounds and stemmed the bleeding. He was gonna make it, but he was one of the lucky ones.
4 agents and 6 Davidians were dead. 32 people were wounded. It was the bloodiest gunfight in the history of the ATF, and both sides now found themselves confronted with the same burning question.
Now what?
Within hours of the firefight, orders came down from above, and the ATF reluctantly stepped aside so the FBI could clean up their mess. But their hands and reputations weren't exactly clean either. The agency was still reeling from the debacle in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, where a showdown with a family of white supremacists ended badly for both sides. And a lot of people felt like the FBI had blood on its hands. But it was bigger than just the one agency. Distrust of the federal government as a whole was a near majority opinion among Americans at the time. They thought it was overreaching its authority and engaging in unnecessary, even unconstitutional force. The FBI had to handle the situation delicately, do it right this time, because if things went south, well, the Branch Davidians weren't the only pissed off people in the country who had a whole lot of guns and nothing to lose.
4 days into the standoff, David Koresh agreed to surrender peacefully on one condition. They had to publicly broadcast an hour-long audio recording he'd made during the raid. The agents passed the tape on to a Dallas radio station, and they actually played it. But Koresh didn't hold up his end of the bargain. He told the negotiators,
My God told me to wait.
And no one came out. The negotiators were understandably miffed that he'd reneged on them, but some of them apparently learned more from Ruby Ridge than others, and eventually cooler heads prevailed. The agents sent in a video camera so Koresh could record the situation inside and give them a better idea of what they were dealing with. Instead, he addressed the camera directly, surrounded by his family.
You come pointing guns in the direction of my wives and my kids, damn it. I'm gonna meet you at the door every time.
And for folks all over the country, it was hard not to empathize. Before long, people were making road trips all the way out to Central Texas. Some to show their support for the Branch Davidians, but most just looking to send a message to the federal government that they just weren't going to take it anymore.
12 days into the standoff, President Clinton's pick for Attorney General was confirmed by the Senate in a vote of 98-0. She was a prominent state attorney from Florida, Janet Reno. At that point, the ATF was just trying to make themselves useful by working security. They set up roadblocks, barricades, and checkpoints where armed ATF agents checked credentials and kept an eye on the growing crowds. Protesters, onlookers, and journalists were gathering around the perimeter. It was a sea of anti-government protest signs and a historically confused mishmash of flags: American, Texan, Confederate, Gadsden, and our most famous contribution to vexillology: come and take it. An SMU student named Michelle Rauch drove down to Waco for spring break, probably making her the first and only person to ever do so voluntarily. Sorry, Waco. Go Bears. She was a journalism major who wanted to cover the siege for the school newspaper, the Daily Campus. She, quote, knew there was another angle to the story, and she wanted to find out what it was. As she approached the ATF barricades, she spotted a tall, lanky guy, 24 years old, shaved head, camo hat, red flannel shirt tucked in his jeans. He was sitting on the hood of his beat-up Chevy sedan, selling the same bumper stickers we still see every day on our commutes to our day jobs. Things like, "When guns are outlawed, I will become an outlaw," which might as well be our state motto.
The guy had driven all the way from New York to show his support and defiance at the standoff. Michelle asked him why, and he told her pretty much the same thing anyone there would have. He was opposed to how they handled the initial raid and thought the local sheriff should have just gone down there and issued an arrest warrant. But it wasn't just this one incident, or even Ruby Ridge. It was bigger than that. It was an ideology of grievance. one that most folks at the time considered fringe and extreme, but now, 25 years later, is just daily discourse on social media and cable news.
The government is afraid of the guns people have because they have to have control of the people at all times. Once you take away the guns, you can do anything to people. You give them an inch and they'll take a mile. I believe we're slowly turning into a socialist government, and the people need to prepare to defend themselves against government control.
She thanked the man and asked him his name.
Tim McVeigh,
He told her. He left Waco 2 days later. For all their caution, the FBI just didn't seem to fully understand what they were dealing with. To them, it was cut and dry. Koresh was a sociopath, and his followers were just hostages. The agents kept telling him just to let people leave, but he didn't understand. After all, they could leave anytime they wanted. The negotiators even tried to trade items like milk in exchange for released kids, but again, they weren't hostages. And to the Davidians, it seemed callous and insane. One member said, quote, "Are you going to bargain with human lives?"
It didn't help that the FBI was so dismissive, if not outright hostile, toward the Davidians' religious beliefs, especially their so-called Messiah. Agents were quoted as calling him a self-centered liar, a coward, phony, child molester, con man, a delusional, egotistical fanatic, and cheap thug who interprets the Bible through the barrel of a gun. And on a few of those points, they weren't wrong, but that's beside the point. The Branch Davidians heard a lot of what was said, and they weren't exactly stoked to be working with a bunch of condescending religious bigots. But still, they wanted to keep the heat off, so Koresh started sending out some of the children, 21 in total, who were scooped up by agents and taken to a nearby church. But their parents stayed behind, and there were still 24 kids left inside. By then, there were 12 tanks, 668 agents, 15 Army personnel, 13 Texas National Guard, 31 Texas Rangers, 131 officers from the Department of Public Safety, 17 from the Sheriff's Office, and 18 local police, all surrounding Mount Carmel. It was the largest military force ever gathered against a civilian suspect in American history. The negotiators were still quibbling over tactics, but they all agreed on one thing. They couldn't let this become another Ruby Ridge or Jonestown or something as unimaginable as it was, even worse.
We need to get this resolved now. People are hurting in there. We need to get this done.
So they made the call to cut electricity to the compound and set up massive PA systems around the property that would blare music and sound effects 24/7 to disrupt their sleep and annoy them into surrender. They played tapes of Tibetan monks chanting, Christmas carol sing-alongs, reveille, telephone rings, the screams of rabbits being killed, and warped versions of popular songs, like Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Were Made for Walking." The New York Times jokingly referred to it as siege rock, and the FBI announced to the press that Achy Breaky Heart was considered but ultimately rejected. And everyone had a good laugh. Except, of course, the sleep-deprived and terrified children living in a televised war zone. If all that sounds kind of familiar, it might be because the government used a similar tactic back in 2003 on prisoners of war in Abu Ghraib. After weeks of negotiation talks, 60 hours with David Koresh alone, the FBI decided the situation was, quote, non-negotiable, and all options were on the table.
James Tabor and Philip Arnold, biblical scholars from Baylor University and SMU, came to the compound to offer their help to the feds. They understood the Davidians in a way the agents never could, and they were deeply concerned that if the FBI didn't change their approach, things were going to end badly. They said the Davidians believed they were living through the fifth seal in the book of Revelation, a prophecy foretelling a round of bloodshed preceded by, quote, a little season, before the believers would suffer through yet another. That's why the Davidians wouldn't come out. They were waiting for the next seal to open, the final judgment of God.
Tabor and Arnold worked fast, recording a tape that presented a different interpretation of the scriptures, one that didn't have to end in violence and death. And Koresh was into it. He was clearly relieved to finally be talking with someone who spoke his language. He responded with a request for time to write down his interpretations of the 7 seals, and quote,
Upon completion of this task, I'll come out and then you can do your thing with this beast.
Inside the compound, people were rejoicing. They might actually get the happy ending they were praying for, but the FBI was skeptical and impatient. They kept badgering Koresh for a timeline. A day? 2? What? Tabor and Arnold asked them to give Koresh 2 weeks. They gave him 3 days.
They told the Attorney General there were children being abused and assaulted inside the compound, and she needed to take action immediately. And if we learned anything from the Satanic Panic era, it's that Janet Reno didn't take those kinds of allegations lightly. On April 19th, 1993, she authorized a full-scale assault on the Branch Davidian compound. Agents called them at 6 a.m. to warn them to take cover. Whoever picked up the phone didn't say anything. They just ripped the cord out of the wall and threw the phone out the front door. 5 minutes later, tanks were ramming the walls of the compound with their guns, literally tearing the structure apart as concrete came crumbling down inside. 400 canisters of CS gas were thrown through the gaping holes into enclosed spaces with plywood walls and floors littered with debris from the gunfight. And since the FBI had cut the electricity, nearly every room was full of lit candles and lanterns.
This is not an assault. The gas you smell and will continue to detect is non-lethal tear gas. You are under arrest. The standoff is over.
Families took cover beneath the pews in the chapel, huddled together, and prayed.
David, you had your 15 minutes of fame.
Around noon, the TV cameras spotted a fire in part of the building.
Koresh is finished. He's no longer the Messiah.
Within 20 minutes, the entire compound was engulfed in flames.
Both the FBI and the ATF deny responsibility for the fire. They'd bugged the compound and picked up chatter indicating the Davidians were intentionally pouring fuel and starting fires. There were confessions and eyewitness testimony corroborating their account, but we don't feel qualified to get too deep into the woods on this, so we'll just say there's some controversy about it. And we always encourage y'all to look things up for yourselves, no matter what. 2 trucks from the Waco Fire Department arrived at the compound to contain the fire, but they were held up at the ATF checkpoint for 17 minutes. A Davidian woman came running out of the building and surrendered to the police. She was carrying a floppy disk with a single word processor file on it. The Manuscript of the Seven Seals by David Koresh. Only minutes later, massive explosions tore through the compound.
Several ex-members of the church were watching while their husbands, wives, daughters, sons, friends, and Messiah died on live TV. We were all watching.
We can see the flames from 2 miles away. Now the flames, oh my goodness. The question is, what about the people inside? What about the children?
Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were watching at a farm in Michigan, where Terry's brother, James, was teaching them how to make explosives from household chemicals.
Tim came running out saying, they're burning Waco, burning it, and nobody's coming out.
James later said.
We could see it was deliberate.
As they watched the compound collapse into the flames, they knew they had to take action. They had to go all in. Larry and Deborah Gilbreth were watching. He stood up and screamed at the TV.
Why aren't they coming out?
And as the towering inferno collapsed beneath the billowing black smoke, their grief and horror was eclipsed only by the crippling pangs of guilt. Did they do the right thing? If they hadn't, he knew these people. They were friends. It didn't have to end this way. The Gilbreths did their first and only press interview for CBS News in 2017. And they said they harbor no ill will toward anyone, not the ATF, the FBI, the Davidians, the media, anyone, except in some small way, themselves. Anybody can tell you it's not your fault, Deborah said, but in the back of your mind, you still have that little doubt, and it's always going to be there.
On April the 19th, I was devastated.
Larry said, visibly choking back tears.
When people see the names, you can go on the internet, you can look at the names of the people that died at the compound. They're just names. I see faces.
In less than an hour, nothing remained of Mount Carmel but a smoldering ruin, just like Victor Hotef prophesied almost 60 years before, just like Elijah's altar, the supremacy of his God, live in color for all to see.
76 Branch Davidians died that day, suffocated, shot, or buried alive in debris.
Koresh had been shot in the head, possibly by his own second-in-command, Steve Schneider, in a sort of assisted suicide or consensual execution. However it went down, Vernon Howe, David Koresh, the sinful Messiah, was only 33 years old when he died, just like Jesus.
There were 5 major investigations, finding fault on all sides. 11 Davidians were tried for conspiracy to murder ATF agents. 9 were convicted on lesser charges, none of which were arson.
A handful of survivors still believe Koresh will come back and that they'll be reunited one day in God's grace. It's easy to make fun, but then we'd fall into the same trap the media did back then. They're still waiting for their kids to come back safe, to come home. As late as 2001, a mother who lost her children in the siege said,
"Some days I thank God that there's a floor to wash, dishes to do, a lawn to mow, anything to keep me busy, because the waiting is hard."
It's heartbreaking.
The ATF director, Higgins, was fired from his post when it was discovered that he and others in the leadership knew in advance that the Davidians were aware of the coming siege and were prepared for it, but he didn't warn the agents on the ground. Many of the agents involved later expressed regrets and entertained their own what-if scenarios for a better outcome. Janet Reno, for her part, publicly expressed her regret for the decision to storm the compound and accepted full responsibility for the loss of life. We definitely don't have time to get into all the legal and political scandals and ramifications. It's already taken 6 months to make this episode, after all.
Seriously, the research took forever because so many typically reliable sources were just lazy and dismissive about anything beyond or before the televised deaths. And even then, it was hard to sort out the facts from the bias. Some major outlets even referred to Koresh as Mr. Retardo, just like the schoolyard bullies from his youth. The media narrative at the time was a bizarre exercise in cognitive dissonance. The people in the compound were portrayed as both the helpless victims of a madman and a deranged cult of maniacs who deserved what they got.
The day after the raid, the President of the United States told reporters, quote,
"I don't think the United States government is responsible for the fact that a bunch of religious fanatics decided to kill themselves."
By casting him as the spiritual successors of Manson, Jones, or imaginary daycare Satanists, it dehumanized them, making the bloodshed easier for the public to digest and dismiss. And by writing off the Davidians' sincerely held religious beliefs as delusional brainwashing, the government, media, and the public at large were able to rationalize it all as a well-intentioned rescue effort gone awry. After all, the followers had to be irrational victims who couldn't think for themselves. How else could they believe such nonsense? They had to be trapped, had to be held hostage, and someone had to save them. But in their own minds and hearts, the Davidians were already saved.
There were a lot of things wrong with the Branch Davidians, especially Koresh. We want to be clear about that. But when it comes to history, you can't fully grasp the horror without the humanity. And there's more than one side to every story.
As Vox put it, quote, "The designation of cult is more often an aesthetic value judgment, a religious group that seems weird. In a sense, God is in the eye of the beholder."
The Branch Davidians came to Texas to live within the gray area between the laws of man and God, between rational concern and nobody's business. And as we watched like voyeurs while they died on live TV, all of us had at least one foot in the gray. When the smoldering ashes of Mount Carmel had finally gone cold, the perception of so-called cults shifted once again towards sympathy. If the story of Waco was written in our collective cognitive dissonance, its aftermath was penned in hypocrisy. The cause of religious liberty and the fear that it's being taken away has been a hot topic since Waco, especially with demographic trends pushing the moral majority into the minority for the first time. The same people who spent decades fear-mongering about so-called cults and scoffing at the beliefs of groups like the Branch Davidians soon found themselves on the other side of the table.
In law enforcement, often religious folks themselves started treading lightly. In a lot of ways, it was a good thing. But it's here in the gray area where groups like the FLDS Church were able to engage in horrific acts of sexual assault and child trafficking at their compound in El Dorado, Texas for years in the early 2000s, before anyone took serious action. It made it possible for a group like Heritage Homestead to cover up the sex crimes of their members as a discrete church matter and still be listed on the Waco tourism website as a fun attraction for the whole family. Not to mention the Church of Wells getting off scot-free for the negligent death of an infant. And that's just the few we have time to mention.
Like they say, everything's bigger here in Texas. Big hair, big trucks, big business, and big personalities. Whether it's David Koresh or Joel Osteen, when there's just something missing, Texas is a hell of a place to find it. But faith these days can be just as secular as it is spiritual.
For years following the siege at Mount Carmel, Janet Reno, Chuck Schumer, and other prominent politicians were inundated with thousands of faxes, comparing them to Hitler, wishing Hitler had killed them, and just generally threatening to murder them and their families. In 1995, an Amtrak train was intentionally derailed, and a note left at the scene claimed it was vengeance for Waco. On April 19, 1995, 2 years to the day that the compound burned, Timothy McVeigh rented a moving truck and packed it with 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and nitromethane. He parked it in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, just as the doors were opening at 9 a.m., and lit a 2-minute fuse. The explosion obliterated the entire north half of the building, killing 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare center on the second floor. 684 others were injured and nearly 300 buildings were damaged in the blast.
McVeigh was arrested and indicted 4 months later with a fake driver's license that listed his birthday as April 19th. He claimed the bombing was a, quote, justifiable response for the crimes of the U.S. government in Waco, and he believed he was in imminent danger from the state. In his mind, it was self-defense, and more importantly, an act of patriotism. After all, what right did the government have to condemn him to death for crimes they themselves had committed?
He was executed by lethal injection on June 11, 2001, and though a judge ultimately denied the request, McVeigh asked to have his death televised on live TV. Maybe someone out there watching might decide, like he did, that it was time to take action. Nothing remains of the compound today but concrete foundations and a deeply felt legacy. There are at least 17 known and active militia groups in Texas, one of which erected a granite headstone-shaped monument at the site, reading, "For 51 days, the Davidians stood proudly." One militia leader was quoted in the New York Times only a few years ago saying,
Waco can happen at any given time, but the outcome will be different this time. Of that, I can assure you.
This is Texas. We scattered Kennedy's brains across Elm Street, and 6 years later, fulfilled his dream of landing a man on the moon. And we'd use that same duality and those very same events to found a new religious movement for a new era, the Church of Conspiracism.
The enemy was still among us, but they weren't deranged hippies or religious fanatics in crazy cults, or even clandestine communists.
Well,
they were the government spooks and death squads willing to slaughter our children over our faith and our guns. The witches were burning witches, and those witches had to burn. Waco became both a rallying cry for right-wing extremists and Exhibit A for conspiracy theorists. The same delusions Janet Reno helped spread across the country during the Satanic Panic came back on her full circle. She stoked their fears for a decade, and ironically, made them real.
The siege of Waco became the spiritual nexus of a kind of bizarre intersectionality, one that inextricably links the cause of anti-government militants, conspiracy theorists, white supremacists, and hardline religious zealots, in a shared delusion of persecution, projection, and paranoia. And over time, this coalition of the fringe wormed its way into traditional faith and mainstream politics. When we were living down in Austin, everybody in town knew about Alex Jones. He was a local eccentric that spewed nonsense so silly and bizarre it just seemed like harmless fun. A decade and a half later, he's informing public policy and getting accolades from the President of the United States. Even our relatively mainstream governor gives voice and traction to conspiracist beliefs, from Jade Helm to vaccines to imaginary bathroom predators.
It's a faith in which the government is inherently incompetent, corrupt, and hell-bent on stripping us of our liberties, and one in which the leader of that very same government deserves nothing less than our unquestioning fealty. A faith that advocates the stockpiling of weapons to overthrow the tyrannical state, and one in which the military of that very same state are unequivocally heroes. It's a faith in which a plurality of those same soldiers are the sons and daughters of the very Texans arming themselves against them. A faith in which the battle flag of an enemy nation flies in reverence beside the flag of the nation they've fought to destroy. Where calls to secede from the Union are a point of pride, and the Pledge of Allegiance to that very same Union is a sacred and mandatory ritual for children as young as 5. A faith in which our own home county's GOP holds high the banner of religious freedom, and yet, just a few months ago, held a vote to remove their own party's chairman simply because of his religion. It's a faith in which all authorities, experts, and truth-tellers are clearly lying. Only a sheep would believe them. And freethinkers know that the real truth can only be found at the bottom of a wishing well. The members of the new religious movement of conspiracism deeply empathize with the people who died in Waco and rightly decry their unjust fate, but at the same time, deep down, wish they'd been the ones holding the guns. It's a secular religion of self-contradiction, projected insecurities, oversimplification, desperate rationalizations, excuses, double standards, doublethink, disinformation masquerading as esoteric knowledge, weakness masquerading as strength, gullibility masquerading as skepticism. It's a witch on a witch hunt, conjuring dark magics to drag his enemies to the stake. And when the condemned spits and screams the truth in his face, he's sincere in his self-delusion when he says, "A witch? Pfft, I know you are, but what am I?" And the swarming, chanting crowd behind him, all of them, someone who just couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, will cheer him on as he sparks the match, because they know in their hearts that they're only a stumble, a misspoken word, a question, a thought, a truthful, objective acknowledgement away from the stake themselves. They have no choice but to go all in. After all, it's better to watch than burn. The media narrative sounds all too familiar, and like we said in the first half of this journey, in Texas, history echoes. And if it teaches us anything, it's that the blind faith in any human leader never ends well. In a world of cognitive dissonance and hypocrisy, savior executioners, and victimized monsters, we're gonna have a hard time coping with the humanity in the horrors yet to come.
As Vernon Howell once said,
We want to go from here to a place of freedom, where we're no longer in bondage to the flesh, our stupidity, our good looks. We want to get away from the guy in the mirror, don't we?
In 1992, Marshall Herff Applewhite moved his flock out to Laguna Hills, California, where they launched a media blitz. They paid to have 12 home videos broadcast via satellite, published page-long ads in national newspapers, and started using the newfangled technology of the World Wide Web to spread the word far and wide. But nobody seemed to be listening. Herff had taken to calling his message, their message, a final offer, but soon rebranded it as a last chance. 2 years later, he sold all the group's possessions except the vans and laptops, and made a last-ditch effort to tour the country and save the world from its imminent destruction. The congregants of Heaven's Gate traveled for 9 months, but their ranks never grew beyond 45. Everywhere they went, they were met with heckling, ridicule, and derision, but no one tried to kill them. And for Herff, that was failure. The beast never came. In August, he told his followers,
It may be necessary to take things into our own hands.
Herff did the math, and based on the warp time he predicted for the next level, the 24 years he'd spent preaching, including those 11 wonderful years with Bonnie Nettles, were a mere 31 minutes on the other side.
All this pain, grief, loss, and darkness was nothing but a momentary blip in the universal existence. It was nothing, and everything else there was, everything that mattered, waited for them somewhere beyond. Somewhere out there, Bonnie was just counting the time-warped minutes until he'd be back by her side, forever and always together. But the crew was having trouble parsing the message from the aliens. What were they supposed to do? Were they supposed to provoke a government attack? Like those poor souls in Waco? They'd bought rifles and handguns as a last-ditch contingency, but they weren't comfortable with them, and they kept them locked up in storage. Armed insurrection just wasn't their thing. But there was another way.
Herff called a meeting to discuss suicide. He'd read up on it on the web, and there were cocktails out there that could make it painless. He asked his followers if they were opposed to the idea of shedding their earthly vehicles by their own hand. A few said they were. A few more said they had some reservations, but they'd keep their options open.
I was just checking. It's just something to think about.
But then something big happened. It was July 1995, and astronomers announced the discovery of the Hale-Bopp comet, a colossal chunk of space rock careening towards Earth, and though it was set to fly right by without any danger to the planet, it was the kind of celestial event that only happened once every 2 centuries.
some members of Heaven's Gate happened to be listening to the radio at the time, a syndicated late-night show called Coast to Coast with Art Bell. Now, we're in our mid-30s, and almost everyone our age is bound to have fond memories of listening to the show as kids late at night. Bell was a conspiracy theorist, but in the more classical sense. People from all over the country would call in with stories about aliens, werewolves, or government plots to hide the existence of ghosts. It was fun and silly, and as far as conspiracy radio goes, Art Bell was like the Miller Lite to Alex Jones's Strychnine. He sadly passed away last year, and with him died that goofy fun Area 51 vampire ghost cabal that conspiracy radio had once so beautifully and innocuously been. Rest in otherworldly peace, Mr. Bell. But anyway.
That night in 1995, some guy called into the show to talk about a photo he'd taken of the comet where a shadowy object the size of a planet was clearly visible in the bright streak of the comet's tail. A spaceship. What else could it be? Bell was convinced, of course, and he posted the photo on his website. Sure, the UFO wasn't visible in any of the other dozen photos the caller had taken that night, and literally no one else saw any such shadowy behemoth in Hale-Bopp's tow. But, the reptilian deep state works in mysterious ways.
The Heaven's Gate members were freaking out. They took the news to Herf, and he confirmed their suspicions. This was it. They were finally going home.
In October 1996, they took out alien abduction insurance policies from a company that also claimed to offer policies for, quote, virgins against immaculate conception, prostitutes against loss of earnings from headache or backache, conversion to a werewolf or vampire, death or serious injury through paranormal activity, and unfaithful husbands against having their penises cut off. Needless to say, the company never paid out. They rented a gorgeous mansion in a gated community out in Rancho Santa Fe, paying the bills with their home-based computer consulting business, just counting the minutes till the comets fly by and their eternal salvation.
They took a group trip to Vegas, rode the roller coasters, gambled away their useless human currency, and just took a moment to appreciate the fleeting, frivolous beauty of life on Earth. They met people they otherwise never would have met. They hiked through nature and encountered animals they otherwise never would have seen in person. And they were truly and completely happy in a way most of us will likely never know. They all sat down and recorded videos, kind of like reality show confessionals, not about their escapades in Sin City, but something so much more important. Their farewells. You can still watch some of the videos online, and if you didn't know what was about to happen, you'd see nothing but smiles and laughter and excitement. It's impossible to deny that whatever it was they were searching for to fill that deep, dark void within them, they'd found it.
Between March 24th and 26th, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet came as close to Earth as it was ever going to come, Herf and 38 members of Heaven's Gate put on matching black Nikes, handmade black uniforms, sweatpants, and custom armbands embroidered with a loving homage to Star Trek. Heaven's Gate Away Team.
They went and choreographed waves. Each of them in turn ate a cup of pudding or applesauce laced with phenobarbital, chased it down with a shot of vodka, and laid down to ascend, their hands clasped around a $5 bill, 3 quarters, and their passport. No one knows for sure the reason why they chose those items, but there's one theory we're personally partial to. A line from Mark Twain's 1907 short story, Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven, in which Twain writes,
"The fare to get to heaven on the tail of a comet was $5.75.
Members assisted those who ascended before them, gently placing a plastic bag over their head and lovingly draping them in a purple shroud, Bonnie's favorite color. In his own farewell video, Marshall Herf Applewhite offered humanity one last chance to save themselves. Once the away team had ascended, there'd be a brief window of time in which stragglers could still hitch a ride. All they had to do was call out the names T and Doe, Bonnie and Herf, and the spaceship would just pick them up and take them away. It wasn't guaranteed though. Some places had better signals than others, and by his calculations, no place on Earth had a stronger connection to the world beyond than Texas.
And on that, Mr. Applewhite, we couldn't agree more.
Sold my soul to the devil one day. I went down there to pray. Set me free, showed me the one. I'm gonna be there ever
written and produced by us, Ryan Sheffield
and Brad Dewar. Recorded here in beautiful Denton, Texas.
Home of the Mean Green.
It's kind of like Austin if it had never moved out of its parents' house.
You know what I mean?
Our theme music in this episode's outro song are by Whiskey Folk Ramblers, whose singer, Tyler, has an awesome new band called Crooked Bones. Check them out.
Additional music by Less Than One and available at freemusicarchive.org. See you soon. Much sooner this time, we promise.
Thanks for listening, y'all.
Come back to me, set me free. Come back to me, you come back to me.